Welcome to the third and final part of my base game Elden Ring Boss Analysis, where today we'll finally leap into the late game of this absolute monster of a title. At this point, we've already analyzed 113 boss fights, but once we hit the late game of Elden Ring, mini-bosses will become less and less common, and the bosses become more and more complex. So, today we'll be going over the Lake of Rot, the royal capital, the Dragonbarrow, the mountaintop of the giants, the Consecrated Snowfield, crumbling Farum Azula, and the game's final gauntlet of bosses. Like with part 2, I'm not going to go into detail on movesets that I've already discussed in a previous video, so if you haven't checked those out, you can check them out in the description below. Before I go into the bosses, I did realize that though I provided a definition for my letter grading in my Dark Souls video, I haven't provided one for Elden Ring. So, the grades I give will either be F, D, C, B, A, or S. A C grade boss means it is average. A D grade fight is something that's disappointing. It's not necessarily something you'd loathe fighting, but it's something you'd like to avoid if the option exists. An F-grade fight is something that actively makes me upset. Something is deeply wrong with the fight that needs to be fixed to justify its existence. A B-grade fight is above average. It means that there's more positives than negatives, even if it's not one of the main highlights or reasons I play the game proper. An A-grade fight, meanwhile, means that that's one of the reasons I play the game. That there's enough good happening here that I want to come back and I'm always excited to re-experience it. An S-grade boss, meanwhile, is the boss fight that as soon as it's over, you immediately want to jump back in, because it was just that good. Without further ado, let's get started with the end of the base game of Elden Ring. But before we do, I realized that in the chaos that was part 2, I missed 2 bosses, one in the Siofra River and the other in the Altus Plateau. So, let's instead begin today's video with the Demi-Human Queen Gilika. Yeah, it's a bit of an underwhelming fight. It comes in with just about 3,200 hit points, which is 700 less than Mount Gelmir's Morgott. The problem is Morgott was already simple enough that if she was placed here at the entrance to Altus Plateau, even she would feel overly simplistic. Out of the repeated fights, this is one of the hardest to find something unique to talk about. The arena is identical, the phase shift is the same, and its fragility means that it's never more than a light speed bump. It lacks any of the identity of a pack leader that Maggie had, and I can see why it didn't show up on a lot of the boss tracker spreadsheets I had found back when I did this run like a year ago at this point. There's just not enough here. Earning another D grade, I think I do prefer Gilika to Morgott, namely because an underleveled boss feels more natural in Altus Plateau's roster than in Mount Gelmir's more challenging space. This brings us to our other missed boss, the Dragonkin Soldier in the Siofra River, one of the strangest and most well-hidden bosses on this list. To fight the Dragonkin, you have to take a teleporter that moves you to an open space where the Dragonkin Soldier will attack you. Compared to the spectacle and scale of the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella, this is a lot less exciting, even more so considering that this Dragonkin doesn't have a second phase. This Dragonkin is balanced to be faced after the Soldier of Noxtella variation, boasting 5,700 instead of 4,300 hit points, which makes the fact that the arena is so much less dramatic and the second phase is missing feel bizarre. It's a really strange boss encounter. The soldier doesn't guard anything major, just a weapon, and it isn't at the end of a dungeon, so there's no evolution on the first version, there's nothing that makes it stick out as such a well-hidden encounter. I think this is the worst of the Dragonkin soldiers, earning a D grade. Of all of the encounters to miss, this one is a battle that still feels like it adds very little. And following immediately after as we dive into the game proper, we have the late game variation of the Dragonkin Soldier, but this version of the boss, like the Siofra River variation, shares very little with the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella. Like the Siofra River, this boss has no cinematic introduction or specific arena. It lounges, this time, in the Lake of Rot and becomes aggressive when the player gets close enough. Secondly, the Lake of Rot does exactly what you'd think seeing it, meaning it's pretty easy for a player to become afflicted with rot if they fight it in the lake proper. And if they don't, the fight will restrict the player to a large platform, similar to the Centipede Demon in Dark Souls. As I mentioned, this Dragonkin Soldier similarly doesn't have a second phase, though here, it makes fighting it on a platform a little bit more pleasant, as all the mobile and ranged attacks are removed. On top of that, it makes it feel sickly in comparison to the first one, which fits with the Lake of Rot. It is strange to have the final boss variation of the Dragonkin soldier be scaled so late after the main boss encounter. But removing these tricks, unlike in the Siofra River where it made the fight empty, ends up avoiding frustrations and adds to the sickly feel of the lake. Not to say that the fight can't be potentially frustrating. The moveset's varied timing is still difficult to learn with the size of the Dragonkin and the lack of a hitbox on that belt. My biggest issue with this Dragonkin, rather than the lack of a second phase, is honestly the Lake of Rot as an area in general. The location lacks any specific intent outside of being unpleasant. The space is covered in rot and platforms with so few enemies wandering around you can count them on one hand. And one of them happens to be the Dragonkin. Without the Dragonkin, calling the Lake of Rot a ghost town would be an insult to ghost towns. Though both the Dragonkin's arena and lack of second phase are a downgrade, I do enjoy this fight despite it. I enjoyed the first one more due to the atmosphere and spectacle of the second phase, but this Dragonkin soldier still adds to the Lake of Rot's atmosphere, earning it a C grade. I wish that it still wasn't the final boss encounter with this enemy, though. It's a great variation on the foe, but doesn't feel like a culmination of its appearances, even if it does justify its own existence more than the Siofra variation. The Falling Star Beasts were our first foes from the stars in Elden Ring, and though their design does look unearthly, the second enemy from the void, Astel, is one of the most uncanny and unnatural designs in Elden Ring in the best possible way. Boasting a skull for a face, long spider-like legs ending with skeletal hands, huge pincers, and this body made of what looked like blue and purple orbs with glowing rings to add somewhat of a shape, all placed along huge insect-like wings. When you combine that with the long, unnatural movements and the surreal soundtrack, Astel goes far beyond what the Falling Star Beasts do, and immediately sells the player on the fact that this is something that does not belong in this world. And when paired with the title Naturalborn of the Void, the fight sells itself on its atmosphere, even within the first few moments without a cutscene. Astel has three major categories of attacks: melee swings, gravity area effects, and ranged offense. The ranged is the most limited, using two major attacks, the first being a long-distance beam, which comes out a little bit too fast for my taste. Like Radon, once you know the timing, it is easy to roll, but the distance between Astel and the player is much shorter, and there's nothing that the player can use as cover, which means the player will usually be hit as they learn the timing. The tracking is also a little strange. It works more often than not, but frequently misses like it does here, meaning it doesn't punish lazy flask usage like Astel is trying to do. The second is a barrage of meteors that hit for some of Astel's highest damage, and the chaotic and random nature of this attack can make it difficult to reliably dodge. Sometimes the meteors won't come anywhere close to the player, whereas other times it feels like all of them head straight towards you. The melee moveset, however, is where Astel feels best. There are a few more regular attacks, such as his bite or a distant tail sweep, but most are much slower, sweeping hand swipes that create explosive AoEs, detonating a moment later. This attack ends up forming a large majority of Astel's moveset and evolves throughout the fight in a really satisfying way. Early on, Astel will only use one swing at a time, making it easier to dodge and move around while you're still trying to target Astel's head. Whereas by the end of the fight, there will frequently be two of these attacks overlapping at any given time. Depth perception was personally challenging, especially when you get two of the horizontal attacks stacked on top of each other. The attack can also slightly edge towards being a little too difficult to predict in the most complicated versions, as it'll be hard to track where the hands are planning to go. The last melee attack is the only one I'm not as big a fan of. The tip of his tail prepares to stab, then bursts down a couple of times. This, like the ranged attack, feels difficult to dodge unless you've already learned where it's going to go. It is a little easier since there is a visual clue for when the stabbing is about to begin, but it's hard to predict where the stabs will land without learning through getting stabbed multiple times first. And to wrap it up, Astel takes the gravity and teleportation magic that Radon and the Falling Star Beast used and makes it feel really spectacular. With the uncanny floating movement, spells that control gravity are able to feel like extensions of the fight. The AoE pulses are a little bit less exciting, as they're difficult to roll through, and it's often difficult to tell if Astel is just using a usual melee strike or setting up a pulse in the ground. Usually the general rule is any completely vertical strike will be a pulsating AoE, but with a creature of this size, diagonal and vertical strikes are tough to tell apart in the moment. All in all, the moveset ends up being a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes it can click really well, but other times it can end up being more frustrating than not. The music and atmosphere, though, is where Astel still really shines. Astel's design is unlike anything else in Elden Ring. Even among the other Starborn creatures, there is nothing as uncanny as this design. and the star-covered sky of the underground arena melded with the colorful design and moveset make this room into an unforgettable encounter. Though there are fights in Elden Ring that I prefer the atmosphere of, like Renala and Rykard, the atmosphere here makes the occasionally unusual eccentricities of the moveset be much easier to look past. Though those eccentricities do hold it back, I think Astel still manages to climb his way into the A grade. Astel is a one-of-a-kind battle that serves as an excellent ending for the tension that the Lake of Rot created. And heading up out of the Lake of Rot, we're back in Liurnia, with two bosses that can only be reached through the lake. Though they technically are in Liurnia, it felt more apt to talk about them at this point, rather than back with many of the other battles in Part 1. The Glintstone dragon Adula is a contender for the strangest of the dragon fights throughout the game. Like Lanciax, Adula appears at the start of the region and faces the player, fleeing once she reaches half health. Then, later in the area, the player can face the dragon down in earnest in a true battle. What's strange about Adula is that her stats completely change between the two battles. Her defenses skyrocket between the two fights, and her health bar doubles in size. I'm not sure why she doesn't have the full health bar and just leaves it 75% instead of 50, because the fact you deal so much less damage in the second fight has always felt a little strange to me. I didn't properly mention this with Big E, Decaying Exeeks for those of you who are new, but the reason he boasted a frankly wild 23,000 health was because he had negative resistances, meaning he took extra damage whenever you hit him. As one of the final two dragons in the base game, Adula's health bar is only 11,000 hit points wrong, but with a much more noteworthy set of defenses, especially against Mykotan's slashing damage. As one of the final iterations of the dragons, Adula is one of the most evolved in terms of their moveset. Not only does she have the slams, stomps, spins, and fire breath you'd come to expect with the damage to provide enough of a threat here, but she comes in with the tightest arena yet, and two major attacks. The first is a crystal charge that explodes and creates tracking missiles. This punishes players riding on Torrent or staying in close. Utilizing cover, a magic shield, or a tight roll are the only real ways to get around this fast move. The other move is a lot simpler to dodge, being a massive greatsword summoned into Adula's mouth that either slams down or flies down into a spin. This move is a lot more easy to space with Torrent or to dodge through with a roll, but it makes Adula feel like one of the more dangerous dragons pretty effectively, especially when Frostbite can combine to make this move deal a ton of damage. The arena is the one place where Adula lingers behind the other dragons. Not only is there a Grace so close by that I ran to avoid a breath attack and ended up sitting at the Grace in the middle of the fight, but Adula has a habit of getting caught on the rocks or stairs and awkwardly floating in the air. Not only that, but her first arena is a great and open space for the fight, so I always found it disappointing to leave that more pleasant arena for a more restricted space that the real battle takes place in. Overall, Adula is a decent culmination for the more magical-focused dragons, earning another high C grade and being the first to score above a Gil. Adula gets close to the B grade, but I'm still just not the biggest fan of the Drake movesets. The duel with Alecto, the Black Knife Ringleader, is the final encounter with a Black Knife Assassin. Despite being the final encounter, though, it's also the most straightforward. Not to say it's easier, Alecto is most certainly the hardest of the Black Knives. But locked away in an Everjail, there's no mechanic of a shortened health bar, no hidden area, no invisibility. The fight is as straightforward as a battle with an assassin-wielding Destined Death could be. And that Destined Death is just one of the things that make this fight so much more difficult. Instead of just using the one ranged attack, Alecto has a few combos that now end with huge downward slams to create huge AoE areas that shred the player's health bar and drain the max. Being hit with this at anything less than full is a quick way to find yourself back at square one. It lingers for long enough that you can't roll through it, and if you don't start to run away immediately, you aren't going to be getting out of range. Especially considering that you can do this attack at close melee range, it's easy for the attack to feel unfair. On top of that, Alecto has one other huge difference from the other assassins. She boasts over 17,000 hit points, making her the tankiest non-gimmick boss fight to this point, and even within the endgame by a wide margin. Morgott, the Omen King, will barely crack 10,000 in his boss battle to give an idea of scale. But with that being said, Alecto makes for one of my favorite Everjail fights. Even though the attack can be frustrating, there is a counterplay that isn't too challenging to discover. And the concept of an optional boss that is impossible to lose runes to, thanks to the Everjail's unique mechanics, means that the difficulty she brings to the table, though frequently overwhelming, is never frustrating. The lore feels great, and the unique name and ridiculous increase in stats makes this feel like a final test on a massively common enemy type. In just 6 attempts this playthrough, I went from dead in less than 30 seconds to only using 2 flasks and a healing physic. The fight is brutal and often hard to learn, but still precise and fair. I think despite lacking the gimmicks of the other battles, Black Knife Alecto is an A grade and my favorite of the assassin fights. In all honesty, the low health and plentiful gimmicks and unique world placement of the assassins made this moment where you face the most powerful version hit even harder, and made even a basic enemy carry a serious weight as a boss fight. The Altus Plateau had one of my least favorite boss rosters due to how underwhelming many of the fights felt for the gateway to the late game of Elden Ring. And now that we've finally passed through the wall and into the royal capital, things honestly still feel a little lagging as we get out of the mid-game, but they do start to improve. Starting off is the second battle with the Grave Warden Duelist. In Limgrave, this boss felt unique and fun, though a little fragile. Even with 4 small pots in the arena along with him, though, this Grave Warden Duelist feels incredibly frail. He does come in above the weaker bulk of the Atlas Plateau with 6,200 hit points himself, though his weakness to bleed and slashing damage don't do him any favors in this footage. As I mentioned, there are 4 small soul jars in the area, and though I go out of my way to take them out, they aren't nearly as much of a problem as the Peninsula Watchdog's imps or later foes' dogs. If anything, the Duelist is more of a threat while destroying the jars than the jars are while you destroy him. They don't add much, but they don't take away much either, and another small complication in the fight does help to extend the otherwise short battle out. There is also somewhat of a second phase here, where the Duelist gives a battle cry that leaves him vulnerable to be attacked, but also increases the damage he deals, his aggression, and reduces the amount of damage he takes after the attack goes off. If he had more health or started this phase earlier, it could work well to boost the fight a little, but as it stands, the fact that you can keep wailing away at him while he buffs means you won't get much of a chance to see this second phase in action. The Duelist is held back solely by his stats, but does still feel satisfying to take down. This is about the point of the game where we start to see Duelists as basic enemies, which can make the boss feel underwhelming, but I think it does still earn a spot in the C grade. It hasn't overstayed its welcome quite yet, and the aggression it puts out means it fits the arena well. Another of the notorious double fights in Elden Ring, the Crucible Knight Ordovis puts 2 Crucible Knights against the player. Ordovis is wielding a sword and shield with 1 new triple AoE burst attack that starts unlocked, and both feature the second phases all Crucible Knights have. As I mentioned in part 2, I did this run after the patch where most duo fights were significantly weakened. For some reason though, despite entering this fight without all of my flasks and usually struggling with Crucible Knights since I don't have parrying down, this fight felt surprisingly doable. With 5,460 hit points each, though the Crucible Knights have improved their defenses from the one-on-one battle with Siluria, they still linger behind most of the capital in terms of bulk. On top of that, the 1 new move that Ordovis adds in actually does a lot to make the fight more possible. As I mentioned, Ordovis will stop, charge up, and then attack only the area around him. In the same way Ornstein's charge separated that duo, this attack stops Ordovis, giving the player time to attack the Spear-wielding Knight. And after the Spear-wielding Knight enters Phase 2, that moveset provides many more regular opportunities to attack, which means, by the nature of walking away from these 2 foes, they will generate openings to land hits, even to someone who's not a master of the movesets. It seems haphazard, but time rarely went by without some opportunity for me to attack. And once 1 Crucible Knight is down, the fight returned to a one-on-one duel, and the lower health means that the fight won't go on too far after that. I think the Crucible Knight Ordovis is, strangely enough, the Crucible Knight boss fight that I have the most fun with, earning another B grade. Though the fight has the capacity to be frustrating, as all duos can, punishing the more vulnerable Spear Knight while the Sword Knight uses his new AoE made for a frantic yet exploitable double battle. Appearing as a full boss fight for the first time, the Onyx Lord's AI has actually shifted to present more of a melee threat, and though it makes the enemy feel better, it still feels too simple for a boss fight. The biggest new move here is this running side slash, followed by a slide into another swing. There's just enough space to roll through, reposition, and then roll through and punish. The attacks in Elden Ring that time out into these almost perfectly spaced punishes will always be my favorites, and I love that this version of the Onyx Lord is able to scratch that itch. and with more melee swings, the Onyx Lord isn't quite as easy as he was to beat up. The only issue is that in Liurnia, he boasted about 4,000 health, and though he is a little more difficult to wail on here, his health is only increased to 4,900, which means with the upgrades that the player should have at this point, the final boss version of the Onyx Lord falls just as quickly, if not faster than the first did. On top of that, the distinction between melee and magic moves is a little too much here. If he's using gravity magic, he presents no melee threat, and if he's using a melee threat, there's no AoEs or follow-up magic to worry about. It ends up making him feel lackluster and like a one-trick pony that has an easy counter to whatever he's doing. The most disappointing of the capital bosses so far, the Onyx Lord only earns a D grade, and since he's one of the enemies that, though they featured as a boss multiple times, never felt like it really earned that title. Now before we pass into the Legacy Dungeon proper, there are a few more nighttime bosses to encounter, the first of which is another instance of the Bell-Bearing Hunter, who actually proves my points about Elemer of the Briar Well. Elemer boasted just under 4,900 health, but this Bell-Bearing Hunter mini-boss variation, barely even an area later, has already jumped up to 6,200 and has a much higher damage output. Like the previous Bell-Bearing Hunters, the atmosphere here is impeccable. The yellow grass of the plateau provides one of the best color contrasts to the enemy thus far, with the red looking great against the dim light that covers the capital's horizon at nighttime. Despite the fact that the Bell-Bearing Hunter hasn't evolved at all from the original match in Limgrave, the complexity yet precision of the moveset combined with the high damage scaling and atmospheric design still feel amazing. And back in the more dilapidated Hermit's Shack, the feeling of a boss arena is gone, letting the Bell-Bearing Hunter's atmosphere really shine through. I think it earns another A grade. I'm also going to do a little plug for my other channel here. At the request of a couple of comments on my first video, I've finished making a build guide for the Pathfinder 2e character I played with a combat style based on the Bell-Bearing Hunter. If you like Pathfinder 2e builds, go and check it out. It's a character I really enjoyed playing. The other nighttime boss is the final appearance of the basic Deathbird. Though this Deathbird technically has more health than the Deathrightbird and Caelid, boasting 8,500 against the Caelid's 8,000, the return to the much simpler moveset here makes the encounter feel much simpler than the earlier battles. The biggest complication here are the enemies. Unlike the Liurnia variations, it's not as possible to get through this fight without attracting at least a few enemies, both bone snails and the skeletons in the graveyard. A commenter on part 1 did point out that the Deathbird can damage the trolls in Limgrave, even though it doesn't target them directly. With the troll's health being so high, that never felt insanely helpful, but the immobility of the snails, combined with the skeleton's habit of sticking to the player and their much lower health, means that the Deathbird will very frequently be taking these mobs out in one hit. The skeletons are the larger threat here, and once you know they're present, keeping the Deathbird from pushing you too far down the hill requires a bit more intent, but isn't too challenging overall. With that being said, I'm not a huge fan of the arena, namely these gravestones, which sometimes have gaps to move through and sometimes don't, which can lead to some frustrating catches. Though not as great as the Deathrightbirds, it's still a decent outro for the simpler template of the encounter, earning another C grade. It's always strange to go back to the basic Deathbird enemies after the Deathrightbird has entered the picture, but they're still decently fun to face. Evolving the Tree Sentinel for a third time in a different direction, the Draconic Tree Sentinel is a boss blocking the entry to the Legacy Dungeon that is the Royal Capital proper. The Draconic Tree Sentinel is technically optional. Doing Fia's questline can teleport you past the Sentinel, but for any player not doing that questline or a player that hasn't found that questline yet, the Draconic Tree Sentinel ends up being required. The base of the Tree Sentinel's moveset remains the same, but the larger axe does a lot to make the moveset feel unique from the first variation. The larger swings all create AoE effects, creating smaller gaps that the Sentinel's more precise halberd left. Since the Draconic Tree Sentinel also adds more ranged attacks to the mix, the boss feels a lot less mobile. Instead of the Tree Sentinel's habit of charging in and out of combat as the player punishes the Tree Sentinel, the player needs to more actively press towards the Draconic Tree Sentinel, which I've always preferred. The Tree Sentinel often sets up the tempo of its own fight, but the player is more in control of the tempo here against the Draconic variation. As I mentioned, the Draconic Tree Sentinel has a ton of ranged options. The horse can breathe fireballs in rapid succession that can each be rolled through as the player pushes back towards this tree sentinel, plus 3 new lightning effects. A single bolt called down by the shield, a lightning AoE as a get off me tool, and a minefield of lightning bolts that demand careful positioning as the tree sentinel starts in on its next attack. It feels like a good evolution of the tree sentinel, changing enough details that even with the same basic chassis, the Draconic tree sentinel still feels unique to fight compared to its first variation. The Draconic Tree Sentinel has the same delayed shield strikes, but loses the magic reflection in lieu of faster melee swings and swipes, letting it output a solid offense from both sides of the horse. On top of that, second phase attacks start to add lightning to increase the hammer's damage, and provide access to many of the more deadly lightning attacks. It gives the fight a great feeling of progression. With that said, there is one big problem here. Out of the game's 11 required bosses, the Draconic Tree Sentinel might just be the easiest to cheese. Crouch, walk behind it, and cast a poison or rot spell. Then, sit and wait until he dies. There are a lot of ways to cheese Elden Ring bosses, but for a potential required boss, this is one of the easiest to find and exploit. Even with that, the circular nature of a Tree Sentinel becoming required just before starting the late game is great. Though the fight is technically optional through Fia's champion, this fight is a much more satisfying duel. The Draconic Tree Sentinel feels more powerful and can pose a solid threat with heavy damage when buffed. Combined with the ability to put on pressure from any distance and a solid 8400 health, it becomes a solid damage check to ensure that you're properly geared and ready for the challenge of the capital, and it does that job beautifully. The Draconic Tree Sentinel earns another A grade. The exploitable nature of it being an overworld boss does make me a little sad, but it still serves as a great benchmark for crossing into the final challenges of the mid-game. The Royal Capital is where we get our first look at the endgame bosses of Elden Ring, and as we draw to the game's climax, as the fights become more incredible, more cinematic, and expand the game's scale even further, we start with Esgar, the Priest of Blood. Omen Killer fixed the Capra Demon, and though Esgar isn't as bad as the Capra Demon was, the heavy emphasis on bleed stacking alongside 2 dogs and a health bar of only 3500 means this fight is a fight that the player has either won or lost within about 15 seconds. Esgar's roster of spells are designed to keep pressure on the player. He has a dagger that he uses to try and harry any players in melee range, breaking the poise of anyone not heavily armored enough in order to set up his dogs attacking. He creates a swarm of flies that can track the player with a long delay, or he shoots 2 to 3 projectiles that come out fast and stack a bleed at a rapid rate. He also has a large slash that explodes a moment later, which serves as some good foreshadowing for Mohg's moveset. Once the player is at a disadvantage, the combination of these ranged attacks and the dogs make it really hard to recover, but there are enough gaps in between the spells that he can't keep up the pressure alone. On top of that, attacks like his slash are great at forcing the player to back off. And when combined with the dogs, that does mean his thinner health bar is fairly well protected at the beginning of the fight. And as frustrating as the fight can potentially be, it's nowhere near a complete dud. Though initially overwhelming, the fight isn't plagued by the strange pathing or camera of the first Capra Demon, and Esgar himself works well as a thematic NPC that starts to build towards the eventual battle with Mohg. Compared to magical bosses like Rvier and Garrus, who felt like their magic was inconsequential, Esgar presents a lot more of a threat, and is a much clearer presence within his own arena. Because of this, I think he earns a D grade. I don't enjoy the dogs, but Esgar himself makes for a pretty decent NPC for a boss fight, and would probably earn a C on his own. Mohg has some great style, and Esgar foreshadows that niche of the world a lot better than bosses like the Sanguine Noble did. Speaking of Mohg, he's another of the Remembrance bosses that features an appearance prior to his full boss fight, but this one is a bit of a unique case. When you meet Morgott, it becomes clear he was behind the summoning of Morgott in Stormvale. He even has another illusory boss he'll summon on the way up towards his arena that we'll get to, but heading through the sewers towards the Three Fingers will put the player against Mohg, the Omen, a one-phased and unvoiced version of one of the game's final remembrances. Like Morgott, Mohg is an incomplete version of his true battle, but whereas Morgott made it clear exactly what his role was through dialogue and a limited second phase, Mohg doesn't aim to make things nearly as clean-cut. Heads up, there are going to be some DLC spoilers in this section. Mohg's soundtrack and moveset here give him an immediate sinister feel. In the dim light of the sewers, Mohg is a black shape with a red scarf lit only by the portals of flaming blood he summons and the dim lights on the edge of the area. This blood can form pools around him, long lines pushing away from him, or spread in arcs before him. In addition to dealing damage as an attack, the fire that is left deals damage on contact and builds up bleed. Mixed with a menacing trident boasting a moveset that makes use of fast but heavy windups to make the player feel the weight of Mohg and his weapon, his status as a threat in the arena and capital becomes clear even without a cutscene to introduce him. But when the player finally defeats Mohg the Omen, they get access to the Three Fingers, and with it, access to the Lord of Frenzied Flame ending. This is where the fight's role in the game becomes a little strange, dropping into one of those areas where questions are hard to answer directly. Morgott has already introduced his ability to create illusory projections of himself to face the player, and it stands to reason Mohg can do the same. In the sewers, the player might have found Mohg's shackle, which does the same thing to Mohg that Morgott's shackle did to him. Because that shackle also works on this illusion, it seems Mohg is creating this projection, but that's where it gets confusing. Mohg is pretending to be in the sewers, despite the fact he's actually enacting other plans. This means this illusion might be here to trick Morgott, which means Morgott asked Mohg to block access to the Three Fingers. Alternatively, Morgott might not be aware, and Mohg just wants to stop the player from reaching the Three Fingers and stopping the Frenzied Flame, as he has his own plans for the lands between, and the Frenzied Flame being released would get in the way. But even deeper, this might be Miquella trying to stop the player from reaching the Frenzied Flame, since we learned in the DLC, Mohg was charmed and to some extent controlled or influenced by Miquella. But this mystery, this lack of answers to me, is what makes the fight serve such a unique role. When you face Mohg the first time, you don't know that he's an illusion. There's no cutscene of him teleporting in like with Morgott. But despite that, the clear threat of the enemy you're facing, combined with the lack of any real context, makes the player's information feel incomplete. That there's something past the surface here that you can't see yet. And as the player is asking questions as they press further into the Three Fingers' area, the disquieting and demented nature of the area and the ending it unlocks is set up to land in an extraordinary way. Mohg feels evil, yes, but the things behind him feel even worse and make the player wonder exactly what they've found. That a creature so clearly evil, so clearly malevolent would want to stop them. On top of that, with nothing about Mohg revealed outside of his name and his first phase, the scale and nature of the true Remembrance fight is still able to land in full, with the existence of an illusion drawing clear lines between Morgott and Mohg. Because of all this, I think Mohg the Omen earns an A grade. He creates an incomplete feeling in the player that the next area pays off on, leaving the player asking questions while still being a unique and exciting boss in his own right. The Royal Capital seems to be the land of early matches of late-game opponents, with Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, often referred to by the community as Goldfrey. He's a required battle on the player's path up towards Morgott, doing two things really well that immediately sets up his rematch later in the game. First of all, the name of this boss makes it immediately clear who you are fighting. I mean, this is the first Elden Lord. And second, Godfrey is definitely not here right now, meaning you're dealing with someone who summoned this spirit rather than the first Elden Lord. And considering this is part of the build-up towards Morgott, who uses summon golden weapons, it both serves as foreshadowing for a perceptive player that Morgott is about to reappear, but also sets up Godfrey's actual appearance later by drawing ties between Morgott and Godfrey. Introducing him in such an idealized way put Godfrey on this unattainable level, making his actual appearance more of a shock. The moveset here works really smoothly. The timing on all of these axe swings is incredibly satisfying. It all feels natural. The jump into a thrown axe strike leaves him vulnerable while also feeling offensive. It all just clicks together in such a satisfying way. With only 7,000 health, he does lack the bulk of Mohg's illusion or even the more frail Morgott, but he has enough offense that he still feels unique. Those long combos and the introduction of stomps and slams that can be easily jumped over feel great. He's threatening, but doesn't feel like he has anything too individually dangerous or spectacular yet. Perfect for a first phase introduction. Introducing one of the final bosses of the game masterfully, the Golden Shade of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, earns an A grade. It's quick, satisfying, and memorable, and even creates a great parallel when, the second time you move into this arena, a new boss will be waiting for you here. I wish that Goldfrey lasted a little longer, but he's still a great stat check before you reach Morgott. So I am going to cheat a little bit here. The player can't actually fight the Fell Twins until after they've defeated Morgott, but I want to end the capital talking about my boy, not about the Fell Twins. That said, though the Fell Twins are nothing but elite versions of mobs, a decent health bar of 7,000 each and a unique arena and theming makes them a lot more memorable than this fight could have otherwise ended up being. As you travel to the tower that unlocks both Morgott and Mohg's Great Rune, the screen goes deep black, like in the Four Kings arena back in Dark Souls. And after you grab a golden rune, the twins push forward and attack. I'm not sure if they were also affected by the nerf, but despite being a 2-on-1 fight, both I and the top 3 search results for Fell Twin boss fight on YouTube ended up being a challenge of facing 2 themed twins in a row rather than a true duo fight. The first of the twins wield an axe, imbued by blood flame that builds up the player's bleed meter with each hit, where the second one uses a cleaver imbued with holy magic. The variation with the cleaver doesn't get a status effect that it deals, but it adds a number of after effects to the end of its slams and attacks, as well as spells that create tracking holy damage. Not only are these notable enough changes to make the Fell Twins feel more significant than the basic mobs, but it makes the Fell Twins themselves evocative of what they are guarding. Mohg wielding his blood flame and relying on strength, and Morgott wielding heavy magic and using spells and summons. The biggest issue with my fight is purely technical. When the battle is over, in order to reload the player back onto the bridge they were standing on, the fight ends by throwing the player into a loading screen, which ruins a bit of the feeling of darkness, falling then rising on the player. I know Elden Ring loads in a lot of things at a far distance from the player, and I imagine it deloaded a lot of that environment to make the fight run more smoothly. All things considered, I think this is one of the best mobs turn boss fights in the game, potentially even in the series, earning a B grade. The Fell Twins are memorable, thematic, and boast unique attacks that make it more than just a room at the bottom of a crypt with 2 omens inside. And unlocking the late game of Elden Ring is the challenge all the areas in the lands between up to this point have been building to. Morgott, the Omen King. And the first thing to say here is that Morgott is an amazing character, especially building off the characterization in the battle with Morgott. Upon entering the throne room at the base of the Erd Tree, Morgott lists off all of his other siblings and half-siblings that, in his mind, have betrayed the Golden Order as they all journeyed after their own goals. Especially Praetor Rykard, whose name he says with so much disdain. This left Morgott as the next in line, something Morgott himself seems to hate. Morgott does not view himself worthy of being a king or an Elden Lord. In his mind, he is a cursed omen, and in this fight he even curses you as his curse begins to affect the throne room he's taken up in. But despite believing he isn't worthy, he is loyal to his legacy above all else, and he will die before a Tarnished sits on the throne. In terms of moveset, Morgott feels like a Phase 3 to the Morgott encounter. Breaking his blade free from the cane he once used, Morgott is immediately more acrobatic. This is one of the places the game really starts to speed up, though the damage here is still fairly tame compared to many of the bosses that will come after Morgott. Outside of the increase to his base attack speed, there are a ton of new combos and summons that Morgott makes use of. He can summon daggers to segment off portions of the arena that continue to fall as he rushes back forward, and starts to summon a spear that he can throw, leap up and slam down with, or add to some of his combos to emphasize his range more than sheer power. Morgott's moveset feels expansive beyond belief, and with so many of his moves moving from one to the next so quickly, he starts to feel like a living enemy. There are very few points where it feels like he is starting a specific new attack, instead feeling like he's cycling between weapons and strategies as he flips and flies around the arena. The player can use Morgott's shackle at the beginning of the fight, but if they use that shackle once, or if Morgott's health is down below 60%, they trigger Morgott's second phase, where he starts to cough before exploding with mud and ichor in a huge AoE that causes additional explosions to burst from the ground. His sword starts to deal more damage, his combos now begin to create explosions in the mud and ichor, and he gains new cursed blade attacks where his sword becomes red with his own blood. His downward slam reappears here, adding blood flame explosions to the end, as well as new lunges and grabs that deal major damage. I should also note that I got a graphical glitch here where the mud didn't stay on the arena, which is a shame because it looks really cool. He also has some great dialogue here, cursing himself for allowing his curse to stain this throne room, and then cursing you for forcing him to reach that point. Like I mentioned in Morgott, the voice actor was restrained and held back a lot in that first fight, and it makes this fight hit all the harder. His screams and rage that burst through his stoicism make this fight feel amazing and climactic. The one issue with this fight that holds it back a frustrating amount is that Morgott only boasts 10,399 hit points. This total matches a lot of other bosses up to this point, but Morgott is the final challenge before entering what is clearly the endgame. And since his damage isn't too high, the player can trade hits with a lot more ease. It's hard to judge Morgott's hit points compared to the next required bosses, as the Fire Giant has a boosted 42,000 hit points from his gimmick, and the Godskin is a duo fight with 26,000. But as a better point, the Black Blade Kindred that serves as the next boss most players will run into has a significantly higher damage resistance, complete status immunities, and only 8,500 health, which means Morgott ends up feeling barely more durable than smaller enemies in the next area. From a gameplay standpoint, Morgott is when the game starts to transition from a fully open-world experience to a more linear run, as the path of Mountaintop of the Giants, Farum Azula, and the Ashen Capital creates many more choke points. Because of this, Morgott ends up being the linchpin setting all of that off, and he does feel great and challenging if you head towards him first, but if you did everything as I did in this run, he doesn't require anywhere near as much practice and execution as other late-game bosses. He is also, uniquely, one of the only bosses who doesn't die after you defeat him. You can find his body, shrunken and shriveled, and he tells you that the Erd Tree has closed itself off, that you, just like him, are doomed to fail. And the player can't finish him off here. Morgott is left to lie, dying alone in this arena. If Morgott did a little more damage, or had a little more health that demanded more careful play, he'd be a contender to be one of my favorite fights, but even with that holding him back, I think Morgott is the gatekeeper for the S grade. If something is better than him, then it's among the best of the best. But before we head into the endgame, we need to head to the Dragonbarrow in Caelid, and it's a bit of a strange area to discuss. In this playthrough, I fought a decent majority of these bosses as I went through Caelid, and so the bosses feel a little scattered. Some feel like they're balanced to be faced here at the endgame, whereas others felt balanced to happen right after Caelid, so that's why for most of these fights, I'll seem to have unleveled from the previous footage. Opening the area, however, is one of the easiest early bosses in Elden Ring, the Knight's Cavalry in the Dragonbarrow. Fighting him here at the same time as the other bosses in Caelid's does reveal that he is significantly more durable than the Caelid bosses. After all, in Caelid, the cavalry only boasted 3,200, while this one boasts almost 7,000 hit points. It's still not a lot if you're properly leveled for the other Dragonbarrow bosses, but the higher damage and health makes this one of the toughest cavalry to face. Unless, of course, you stand on the other side of this wall that lines the bridge, in which case the cavalry frequently leaps off the cliff and dies instantly. Combined with the fact that he drops Bloodhound's Step, one of the best defensive Ashes of War in the game, this is a common boss to see killed with this oversight at the start of challenge runs. Within the walls of the bridge, the only thing that this cavalry can get stuck on are the gnarled mushrooms, and the bridge usually keeps the cavalry in towards the player, meaning the usual AI problem with the cavalry is minimized a lot here. Whenever the cavalry isn't running away, the fight stays a lot more engaging. I think the Knight's Cavalry in the Dragonbarrow earns a C grade. It doesn't boast the atmosphere of the Liurnia versions, but it works much better than the other variations. And though it is easily cheesable, it feels suited for the strange balance of the Dragonbarrow. And the final version of the Bell-Bearing Hunter, who is scaled pretty far past the others, is found here in the Dragonbarrow. Boasting 10,600 hit points, which is even more than Morgott, and some solid endgame scaling, the Bell-Bearing Hunter poses a major threat, especially if the player finds him while traveling through Caelid. And even if they don't, the Hunter continues to work just as well here as it works in each of the prior variations. If there is one criticism that I do have, it's that the Hunter's spawn point is a bit strange compared to the others. Instead of appearing from within the building, he appears out of this plant, which is underwhelming compared to the first one's introduction. There's also nothing that really makes this final variation feel significant compared to other battles. A lot of the final battles we'll see, especially in terms of the more challenging bosses, do feel significant, but this Bell-Bearing Hunter is just more of the same. Even with that, I think this Bell-Bearing Hunter is still an A-grade encounter. I love the battle so much, and I wish that Elmer had more tricks up his sleeve, because the Bell-Bearing Hunter still remains one of my favorite foes. The third of the final dragons is Grail, boasting 11,500 hit points. Grail is the most basic of the three final dragons. Adula was endgame scaled with an emphasis on magic attacks, and a later dragon will focus primarily on a gimmick, but Grail has the same moveset that Agil did. Straightforward bites and fire breaths, but on a tight bridge. Assuming, of course, Grail decides to stay on the bridge, since it is very possible for him to get stuck on this tree and completely destroy his AI. Fun fact, the fire breath attack is not connected to the dragon. The fire breath will move forward, even if the dragon doesn't. The more you know. But with that small error aside, Grail still does pretty well. Like all the dragons, fighting him by nipping the ankles means almost nothing he does can threaten you in any way, but removes the potential of trying to hit his head for bonus damage. If the Dragonbarrow didn't boast at least one dragon fight, it'd be a bit of a disappointing area. And Grail does fit the area pretty well. I think Grail earns another C grade. Not a bad fight, but not a great fight due to how many holes exist in his moveset, especially when exacerbated by the issues on the bridge. The second appearance of the Godskin Apostle in the Divine Tower features an identical moveset, but with almost one of the single largest jumps between enemy scaling. The Altus Plateau has 7,500 hit points, but this Dragonbarrow variation almost doubles both the outgoing damage and health, as the Apostle hits 13,500. This Apostle blocks access to Radahn's Great Rune, which means this fight always happens at least after the main bulk of Caelid. The moveset still works well, featuring those two unique phases that do grow in an engaging way, though the smaller arena does mean that the second phase is even better at reaching the player quickly. It means the Apostle here is usually more of a threat than the Windmill Village, even when you're correctly scaled. The biggest difference is the atmosphere, specifically the atmosphere of the arena, and between the Windmill Village and the Volcano Manor that the Noble was found in, this is the worst of the arenas. The Apostle's horror-adjacent design doesn't shine like it did in the Windmill Village, and the arena is less imposing than the Noble's. There's nothing unexpected as you face the Apostle here, which is a shame. I think this Godskin Apostle sits in a high B grade. The enemy type still works well, and the 13,500 health does give him more endurance than even Morgott, making him a notable enough threat to feel like a challenge, especially if you find him early. Another of those few arenas that the players will drop down into, the Beastmen of Farum Azula have always felt a bit like a confused battle to me. When you drop into bushes tall enough that the player can drop in stealth, getting the ability to ambush the fight like it was an overworld battle. Once the fight starts, however, the bushes and fauna serve as more of a visual hindrance, often obscuring the Beastmen behind them. There are two Beastmen, a scaled-up version of the Cleaver variation that we saw all the way back in Limgrave, and a throwing knife wielding one that is the major threat here. The throwing knives themselves aren't too dangerous in a vacuum, but they become difficult to handle alongside the attacks of the Cleaver variation. Again, the Beastman attacks just enough to keep a solid pressure on, and adding a barrage of knives on top of that does not really pan out in a satisfying way. The strategy here for the player is pretty clear. Use the low 3,300 hit points that the throwing knife version has to whale it down, either by sneaking in opportunities, or by using sleep pots, spirit ashes, anything like that. After that's done, the last Beastman's 8,300 health does pose somewhat of a threat, but the moveset remains just as straightforward as it did in Limgrave. And if you're scaled properly for the Dragonbarrow, he poses very little threat once that throwing knife version is down. Fighting them at this scaling, however, meant that the enemy was decently exciting, as a single hit could often threaten over half my health bar. But the way these attacks overlap isn't satisfying to dodge. And if you decide to use Spirit Ashes to balance the start of the fight, the second half turns into an absolute nothing of an encounter. I think the Beastmen earn a D grade. They feel like one of the lazier duo enemies with an arena that tries to utilize stealth to set them apart, but doesn't actually offer anything of real depth, outside of choosing who you'll land your one free hit on. Reappearing at the Dragonbarrow Erdtree, the Putrid Avatar returns with just over 12,000 hit points. This makes it another member of the club that somehow has more health and damage than Morgott, though the simple moveset means the fight doesn't feel quite as overwhelming. Like all the avatars, the fight is easy to find, and the Putrid Avatar works well as a variation of the enemy. It lands in that strange spot in the entry to mid-game. It's a lot more powerful than the avatars that came prior, but lingers pretty far behind the damage of the final two to come. With that said, the damage here is still enough to threaten a player working their way through Caelid. I still really enjoy moving through the attacks of the Putrid Avatar, and this is just more of the same. It serves less of an overworld role than the initial Putrid Avatar did, as it's further back into the Dragonbarrow. It can technically warn a player who used the teleport to know what they're up against, but that's assuming the player already decided to run past the next boss on our list without noticing how powerful it was. The Putrid Avatar gets another B grade. We'll be seeing this fellow just one more time, and then his work is done. And traveling forward in time again to that aforementioned boss, this is the encounter that hopes to inform players that they are, in fact, not supposed to be here yet if they've teleported to Goronk. Using the halberd and sword variation of the Valiant Gargoyles, the Blackblade Kindred also gains, true to his name, Black Blade attacks that add huge AoEs and ranged effects onto some of his attacks, though only a few actually reduce the player's max health. Now in a one-on-one battle with the poison attack replaced with a much clearer set of AoEs, the Blackblade Kindred's moveset is given the chance to feel a lot better than it did in that chaotic duo battle. The Kindred moves quickly, and the tempo of most of his attacks are clear, with the charges all being pretty well telegraphed to the player. He boasts 12,300 health, but has an incredibly high resistance to anything that is not strike damage, making him feel even tankier. The transformation attacks feel particularly good in a one-on-one, as they now leave clear windows while still looking cool, and allowing for a far more diverse moveset than they would with a single weapon. And I cannot fully overstate how much better this enemy feels without the Poison Breath attack. That attack remains absolutely miserable to dodge, whereas every attack that replaces it feels so much more dynamic. There is almost no downtime, as the Kindred is constantly re-pushing towards the player. There's one big issue, and that's the fact that the Kindred, for a gargoyle with wings, is incredibly bad at flying. The Black Blade is set right at the bottom of these stairs, and it will pretty frequently jump up onto the higher ground. And when its attacks and leaps put it partway into the air, the Kindred will pause attacks, drop strangely, or otherwise just feel janky. I've never personally seen the Kindred store attacks and start them again after a drop, which means it most likely just breaks the atmosphere rather than being mechanically frustrating. The biggest thing that the Kindred does, though, as I mentioned, is inform players that have found Goronk, which they can do as early as Limgrave, that they are significantly underleveled for the area past him. As soon as the player tries to leave Goronk to get their bearings, the Blackblade Kindred is there to take them down in just one, maybe two hits. By making the area intimidating, it does a great job making Goronk intimidating when the player teleports in one time and sees him aggressive. The Blackblade Kindred has taught us what level of threat to expect, and especially considering Goronk is setting up a later boss fight, making Goronk feel more powerful makes Malekith feel more powerful later on. It is a great piece of overworld and overall game design that the Blackblade Kindred plays a huge role in. The Blackblade Kindred earns an A grade, though I think it'd only be a B grade for combat. The placement in the world makes this one of the most memorable encounters, and helps build towards that eventual battle with Malekith. And following immediately after that is another Blackblade Kindred, this time using the Twin Blade and swapping to a shorter axe to make for the two movesets, and featuring a much lower health pool, only 8,400 compared to the Dragonbarrow variation's 12,000. And though the DNA of the fight is similar to the one that came before, I think I prefer the halberd and sword moveset to this one. The Twin Blade lacks a lot of the more precise nature of the halberd as a distance-focused weapon. The Kindred attacks are always focused on aesthetics, but the sweeps, charges, and slams of the halberd are clear and direct. It is clear when an attack is starting and when it's ended, and the nature of the Kindred charging in constantly means that it leaves plentiful windows that reward getting in past that longer weapon's threat. The Twin Blade, meanwhile, is a little too showy for my tastes. Some of the attacks, like the uppercut, feel great, but there are a lot more backstepping slashes, and the charge is not only less intuitive, but leaves it a less natural attack window than the halberd's charge did due to an AoE after effect exploding when the charge finishes. It's not a bad move, it just doesn't feel quite as good to fight. The axe, meanwhile, has some of the coolest ideas in terms of the Kindred's weapons. The attacks from this weapon are the fastest of all four. Slams, slices, charging uppercuts, and all of them keep the Kindred from flying around too frequently, making this one of the most fast-paced and satisfying to dodge movesets. Occasionally, though, the Gargoyle will do a battle cry, Once it does, the next attack will not only hit, but create an AoE that can be jumped over afterwards. It does create a great natural rhythm within the axe phase as he moves between this quick barrage of swings and a huge AoE. But the nature of the attack means that the best way to dodge it is to just move behind the Kindred rather than roll and jump to engage, as the attack comes through quickly enough that you don't frequently have time to do both. The arena for this Kindred does work better though. There are some trees the Kindred will get caught on, but there's nowhere near as much strangeness with gravity as the staircase in the Dragonbarrow caused. Even if you move up onto the stairs here, the whole area is a staircase, which feels a lot smoother than the flat surfaces in the Dragonbarrow did. Though I still give the edge to the Dragonbarrow variation, it is not by much, and the second of the Blackblade Kindred still earns an A grade. The Forbidden Lands is a strange area as you move up towards the mountaintop of the Giants, but the placement of a Black Knight Kindred on the path feels like a natural and interesting challenge as you enter into what is that last major open world set of areas in Elden Ring. The game's penultimate Knight's Cavalry in the Forbidden Lands is scaled just under the Dragonbarrow variation of the enemy, sitting at 6,600 health versus the Dragonbarrow's 7,000. They may not be twins, but they still feel about equal. The Forbidden Lands in general makes for a strange place to discuss boss fights. It's an atmospheric walkway that takes the player away from the capital and spits them out at the start of the mountaintop, which combines with the snowfield to form the final open world region of the game. The Blackblade Kindred feels like a guardian, but the Knight's Cavalry here doesn't capture that same feeling. It does fit the atmosphere of the region, but it doesn't feel as entrenched in it as the Kindred does. The biggest reason why is because there are a ton of rocks, slopes, and trees on this bridge, and the Knight's Cavalry AI is almost as bad here as it was in the Dragonbarrow. Though less easy to cheese, this cavalry is constantly getting stuck on the other side of small ledges and trees, to the point that it's almost a given he'll get stuck if you're fighting him normally. It just becomes a question of to what degree and on what. On the other hand, the visuals of the arena work really well with the Knight's Cavalry. The deep fog with these echoes of color in the distance works well with the white of the snow to make the cavalry really pop out from the gray background, while still also allowing the cavalry to step out from within the fog without missing a beat. Overall, I think this Knight's Cavalry earns a high C grade, being one of the better of the average variations. The AI limitations and pathing issues means it does linger behind the other atmospheric locations, but the atmosphere also sets it apart, even if it does lack that comparative purpose or identity on the world map as a whole. By the time you've reached the mountaintops, the ancient hero has become a regular enemy, but he still gets one final showing as a boss encounter in the mountaintops hero's grave. And it does get a significant health increase from the last encounter, rising from 3,800 to 6,800. And though that may be the most notable health total for the enemy up to this point, the most danger I was in throughout this fight was reaching the boss with a single flask, or having my controller disconnect while I was at half health. Though the ancient hero does fit well in the mountaintops, the design still struggles in the catacombs compared to the Everjails. The frost looks great, but the rest of the moveset and design doesn't pop out like it does above ground on the snow. On the other hand, the snow doesn't pop as well above ground, which means some of the moves in the second phase do feel better here. Though the ancient hero still feels trapped as a mob turned into a boss, the speed in second phase means it doesn't feel like a pushover, even with the low health bar. The music feels a little off, as we get the almost heroic Erdtree Knights theme that's used for the Tree Sentinels, rather than the more atmospheric-focused mini-boss tracks like Fallen Knights or Black Knife Assassin. It's not bad, but considering how frequently the ancient hero lurks on the edge of the arena, it makes for a strange musical choice. Overall, I think the ancient hero of Zamor here pushes into a B grade. It's still a solid battle, and of the mobs used for boss fights, there are only a few that work close to as well. As we've encountered with the last few bosses, the encounters in the mountaintops are often scaled just under the versions in the Dragonbarrow. And as some people pointed out in part 2 of this series, the Putrid Tree Spirit I included in Caelid, located at the back of Radahn's arena, is actually scaled for the Dragonbarrow, and not for Caelid, which is why it had that whopping 18,000 health. But despite most bosses only losing about 5 to 10% of their max health here from the Dragonbarrow, the ulcerated Tree Spirit in the mountaintops loses 30% of the Putrid Tree Spirit's health bar, coming in with only around 13,000 hit points. Though that's still enough to give it some solid bulk, as it still boasts more health than Morgott, it feels fragile compared to most other Tree Spirit health bars, outside of course, that Mount Gelmir variation. We're back indoors, which makes it uniquely strange how much less health this Tree Spirit boasts. Compared to the other late game bosses, where difficulty often jumps up in the mountaintops, this feels more like a step back. As I mentioned in Mount Gelmir's version, the Tree Spirit also works better outdoors than it does indoors. That also doesn't make this one bad, but it's another thing that makes the Tree Spirit struggle to stick out this deep into the game. I think this Tree Spirit is another C-grade variation. The moveset still has that inherent rhythm to it, but the camera struggles in the lower health makes it feel less significant than the Putrid Tree Spirit. Even with that, it's still not fragile enough to feel fully inconsequential. Meanwhile, while the Dragonbarrow offered a putrid avatar with 12,000 health, the mountaintop boasts what is by far the most challenging of all the Erdtree avatars in the game. The health may be lower here at only 11,500, though the Erdtree avatars have less of a fire weakness than the putrid avatar did. The major struggle here is that once the avatar is down to about 70% of its health, it splits into two. The two avatars share a single health bar here, meaning any hit will put you closer to the ending of the battle, and there's not the usual underwhelming ending that most duo fights have. On the other hand, the avatar is not designed for a 2-on-1 fight. The holy magic attack that forces you to circle the avatar works great when both do it at once, but when they decide to stagger the attack, it can stop the fight in its tracks for a long time. On top of that, the large swings and slams can pass through the avatars, meaning that as they press against each other, it's easy to get hit by attacks that you didn't see coming. With attacks overlapping frequently, the most satisfying part of the avatars, which for me has always been pressing through the attacks to keep the aggression up, isn't something that's as easy to find here. On the other hand, once you do manage to separate them, the player is massively rewarded for keeping aggressive once that window arises, and the plentiful openings in the moveset end up feeling like a solid final test for the avatar. Though the avatar does struggle to implement its duo fight, it does feel like a solid climax to the enemy variety. The fact that the avatar teleports in and uses magic to split in half makes this feel like an apex of the enemy type. It works as a final version of the standard avatar, even if it doesn't feel great as a duo. I think this Erdtree avatar does still earn the B grade among the rest of the varieties. I wish there was something done to make it easier to tell what animations the avatar behind the other avatar was doing, because with a little bit more clarity on what attacks you're dodging, I think this duo fight had a solid base. Shared health bars are a great way to keep tension up throughout an entire fight. As you've seen, most of the encounters moving into the mountaintop of the giants do increase their damage and durability, as being behind Morgott secures them as a late game foe. After all, we're almost within the last 20 boss fights of the base game. The last time we saw a Death Rightbird was back in Caelid, where its scaling placed its health around 8,000. The Death Rightbird here leaps up in a massive way, doubling its health to reach over 16,000 hit points. On top of that, this Death Rightbird does one thing that sets it apart from every other bird in the game. It appears during the daytime. The mountaintop is a great area to have this thing arrive at any point in time. The area around it is covered with tibia mariners that summon the giant skeletons, and to continue down past this thing feels like a great capstone to the ruins. The last two Death Rightbirds in this game are terrifying foes. People often refer to the last Death Rightbird as the hardest one, but personally I've always had the most trouble with this variation. If you're fully upgraded then you'll be fine, but in this run, where I was trying not to overlevel the areas I was in, it made this bird feel ridiculously tanky. I should mention that the Death Rightbird has a massive 40% weakness to both strike and holy damage, and as an undead enemy, spells and abilities that deal one of those damage types and bonus damage to undead absolutely shred even their massive health pools. In that way, the Death Rightbird does a great job serving as a satisfying stone wall, while also having a good way to delete its health bar in a way that isn't as unnatural to stumble upon while exploring. I think that this Death Rightbird joins the others with a B grade. I still like the Liurnia atmosphere a lot, and though this bird manages to work both in the daytime and nighttime, I don't think it quite surpasses it. The second and final of the commanders is a more typical boss variation of the foe, and is one of the requirements for getting into the Consecrated Snowfield, the game's final major zone. Like the O'Neill battle, the base of the fight is structured around dealing with Niall's summons, then facing the commander in a more straightforward one-on-one battle. There are 4 big differences here. The first and most obvious is the change of status. O'Neill used Scarlet Rot to blend in with Caelid, whereas Niall uses Frost and Lightning. I personally prefer the reds of the Scarlet Rot, especially amid the Rot of Caelid, but this one is fully a matter of taste. The second is in the arena. O'Neill was an overworld battle, which meant Torrent was available, and Niall is in an arena at the end of a legacy dungeon, meaning no Torrent and a much more limited space. It also means that Niall is properly scaled for his area, unlike O'Neill being scaled for above Caelid. O'Neill has 9,200 health, and Niall has 15,500. Though it's an increase, we just saw the Deathbird double its health, so that's not as scary as it sounds. The third difference is the enemies summoned. Niall only summons once, which is an improvement to O'Neill bringing the fight to a halt halfway through. He also seems to focus more on offensive buffs than defensive buffs, which pairs in a nasty way with the knights he does summon. Instead of basic enemies, 2 Banisher knights arrive in the fight. The one with the shield is fairly passive, though still more aggressive than Niall himself. But the dual-wielding knight is relentless. They're tough enemies to dodge on their own, and even more so whenever any attacks overlap. The final difference is the existence of a second phase within Niall himself, and there are a lot of cool details here. The second phase is what adds lightning to the moveset, providing shockwaves that can be jumped over, huge leaping slams, a dash into an uppercut, and this massive attack that boasts what I believe is the single largest punish window on any great enemy in Elden Ring. All of these attacks are made using Niall's prosthetic leg, which is cinematically really cool. On top of that, the entrance into Phase 2 is really unique. If both banished knights have died, Niall enters Phase 2 immediately, going from a passive buff-focused character in Phase 1 to an aggressive acrobatic threat. But if Niall is reduced down to 50% health, that same thing happens. This means that if a player manages to focus the commander down, they're rewarded with the removal of the knights before things ever get too intense. It also stops players from using Bewitching Branches, a consumable that turns enemies against each other, into an instant win strategy. That way, they have to deal with the aggression of the knights and then deal with the second phase of the moveset. There's not a way around it. Commander Niall earns another egg raid and is a great endgame check before allowing access into the Snowfield. I think I do have to give him the edge over O'Neill, too. O'Neill may work exceptionally well as an overworld opponent, but the way this second phase engages with the existence of the minions is amazing, even if the minions present are potentially more frustrating than the ones in O'Neill's. And the final of the base game drakes is Borealis, the Freezing Fog. And whereas Adula focused on unique attacks and Grail went back to the basics of the enemies, Borealis puts atmosphere first and foremost. And though I see a lot of dislike and hate for Borealis online, I enjoy this particular Drake variation a lot, as it feels like it creates some of the spectacle these fights rely upon to stay with the player. Borealis also uses those area stomp attacks to make attacking the ankles just a little bit more dangerous. As you approach where Borealis spawns, a thick blizzard falls onto the arena, and Borealis appears from within. The lowered visibility turns him into a silhouette. The roar, combined with the dragon's distinct music, does a great job making it clear what you're fighting even before the player has seen Borealis. With how frequently Borealis flies around, the snow adds an excellent layer of complexity to a more straightforward moveset. Though I've heard a lot of frustration with the lack of visibility, my issue is actually the opposite. Within 30 seconds, the fog is gone entirely, returning the fight to a standard Drake battle. Though I can agree with the criticism that the fog goes a little too far, making it so the silhouette only appears once you're close to Borealis, I wish that the fog either occurred throughout the fight or was designed to last as long as the player remained on the lake, because this is one of the most memorable Drake battles to me. The storm gives Borealis a huge presence and makes it feel like a finale for an enemy in the way that Grail and Adula didn't, even when their stats were comparable. There is also a huge and exploitable weakness with Borealis. Use a hammer or any other strike damage weapon, and you'll do a massive amount of damage through the ice. There are plenty of enemies that use a weakness, but huge weaknesses setting the Drakes apart clicks really well for me. It makes common enemies just that much more unique when you're encouraged to bring unique weapons to abuse one. Despite that aforementioned dislike, Borealis is actually my favorite of the base game Drakes, and I think he's the only Drake of that group that earns a B grade. I really enjoy the atmosphere in particular, and especially in those first few moments, it makes you feel like you're fighting a sentient snowstorm. Like Adon, Vyke is another NPC boss fight placed within an Everjail, and where Adon felt a little too straightforward to fit as a boss encounter, Vyke's moveset does lend itself far better to the encounter than Adon's did. Armed with a spear in one hand and a talisman in the other used to buff said spear and summon lightning bolts in front of him, Vyke feels like he earns his spot within the Everjail. Though Vyke is fragile, boasting just over 5,000 health plus one Estus flask that heals somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500, Vyke does make up for it somewhat by putting a heavy emphasis on his dodge rolling. On top of that, the longer range of the spear compared to Adon's mace means Vyke is a little tougher to dodge. The jumping dive isn't too challenging to dodge, but feels much more intimidating than the wild strikes that Adon utilized. The lightning that Vyke summons down also has significantly more presence than that slow fire orb, as it requires immediate dodging and doesn't last too long. The damage buff on the weapon needing to be recast creates a good tempo if the fight goes on long enough, and the complete immunity to all status effects avoids a lot of the cheesing that most NPC fights can suffer from. Vyke may not be an incredible fight, but even as an NPC, he does everything an NPC should do. He feels a little heftier than an invader, though still doesn't feel absurd or quite reach the level of a boss fight. His moveset feels full and engaging, meaning I think he earns a C grade, which is decent praise for an NPC with such low health. I mentioned all the way back in part 1 of this series that the Spirit Caller Snail in Liurnia struggled to feel like a satisfying encounter since you never had to really interact with the Crucible Knight. The snail in the mountaintop of the Giants must have heard me, because it now places itself as the third foe in a short gauntlet, putting the player against a Godskin Apostle and a Godskin Noble before they get to fight the snail. And these both make for fairly durable variations as well. Damage is scaled to just short of endgame, with the Apostle having 9,800 and the Noble having 11,800. Though not as individually challenging as the Apostle and the Dragonbarrow, the back-to-back nature and much smaller arena turns this into a boss that demands an understanding of these enemies' movesets. Not only does this make the snail feel like a powerful summoner, but it forces the player to ensure that they're comfortable with these enemies, which is a good thing for the game to do just before Farum Azula, namely because the final challenge with the two Godskin comes right after the mountaintop of the Giants, unless you head to the optional Snowfield first. It reuses these enemies to test the player's confidence, which feels great and works alongside the overworld. My one minus here is the bushes and trees within the arena. I love the water in the arena and how it reflects light, but when the player is in the bushes with their visibility blocked, it doesn't feel very good. Especially with how mobile both the Godskin are in their second phase, it's something most players often find themselves dealing with in less than fun ways. I think the Spirit Caller Snail still earns an A grade. Properly testing the player on two enemies they need to be comfortable against in one of the next required bosses gives this snail infinitely more presence than it had in its first iteration, and still makes for a memorable boss encounter in the same way the first did. Often, when I look at the main Remembrance bosses in Elden Ring, I have an easy time deciding how I feel about them. But the battle with the Fire Giant, on the other hand, is difficult to discuss. It's got some of the admittedly messiest pieces of design of all major bosses in Elden Ring, but there are a couple parts of this fight that make it one of the bosses that I have the strongest memories of. Though I remember my first time conquering most major bosses, Fire Giant is one of those fights that I remember everything about that final attempt. I remember the time of day, who was with me where I saw that phase transition for the first time. I remember realizing how to damage the second phase for the first time, and the moment I finally took him down. Even next to bosses that I know are better, the Fire Giant somehow lingered in my mind more than any other fight in the game. Let's begin with the obvious. The Fire Giant is giant, for lack of a better word, and does the damage you'd imagine something of this size would. Boasting an astronomical 42,000 hit points, the Fire Giant is built around weak spots. In Phase 1, this wounded leg is the place to attack, and unlike other bosses with weak spots, the Fire Giant relies on his health to discourage attacking the rest of the body. He has no physical resistance and even has a weakness to slash damage. But if you hit his weak point, the damage you deal doubles, making his health effectively 21,000. As I mentioned, the weak spot in the first phase is the left leg, made visible via this splint and visual tearing on the skin. On top of that, with the legs being the only things reachable from the ground, it becomes pretty easy to figure out the fight's gimmick. It also makes Morgott's low health total feel even more abnormal. The boss progression at the endgame of Elden Ring goes from Morgott with his just over 10,000 hit points to the Fire Giant's 42,000. And even with a 100% damage boost, Morgott feels flimsy next to this fight. Phase 1's moveset is fairly simple. A shockwave to roll or use Torrent to run around, a jumping slam, a general slam, some stomps, and a few spells. A tracking fire projectile, and the explosive fire orb that was introduced back in Adon's boss fight. It works a lot better in this encounter as the player will have often already reached the weak point and be attacking it, giving them the option to continue attacking until the last possible moment, or to try to set the explosion off earlier to create later windows. The Fire Giant also plays Dark Souls 3, rolling around constantly to create space. It definitely feels different than the usual jump backs and teleports that other large enemies use, but it also feels a little silly as you'll take half your health from this giant suddenly doing a barrel roll at you. The best part of this fight comes in the phase transition, both how the first phase builds up to it and the transition itself. The player's attention would naturally have been focused on the leg, meaning that the giant splint will have broken partway through the first phase, which slightly increases the giant's aggression. After reaching the first phase's health gate, however, the leg twists and snaps back, dropping the Fire Giant down to his knees. The giant tears off his own leg and seemingly ritualistically sacrifices it, and in doing so, opens the eye and mouth that a perceptive player may have noticed in the first phase. From a design standpoint, I absolutely adore the Fire Giant here. It looks monstrous, and watching it enter second phase, taking a huge chunk of damage as the eye hones in on your location is incredible in every sense of the word. The issue with the second phase comes from the actually fighting it part. With the broken leg burnt away, the place to attack now is his hands. The issue is that, unlike the foot, the hands are not the center of his balance. They'll often swing around as he adjusts, or stay in the air as he casts spells, or does some general flourishes. His slams and stomps are replaced with swipes and an elbow drop that can make it easy to punish his head, though that head doesn't take the bonus damage, which feels a little funky. The pyromancy he already had also increases in potency here, doubling each effect, and he unlocks new abilities. He can erupt, which is a difficult move to dodge outside of just making space and waiting it out. He can cast a firestorm that bursts up in pillars that seem chaotic but are actually fairly well defined, or he releases a fire breath with a hitbox that is not anything near well defined. Learning this phase can be very frustrating, and with the amount of damage dealt, the Fire Giant is where the endgame of Elden Ring has unquestionably landed. There's a lot of discourse in general about the endgame of Elden Ring. The core gameplay loop for every single fight prior to this point is that if you were struggling, you go out, you explore, level up, find new weapons, improve your gear, and come back when you're ready. But starting at the Fire Giant, your weapon is expected to be max or right next to max. Your health should be topped off at 60 vigor, and there's not really any more gear to find outside of things you may have missed, or a few upgrade weapons that are usually more horizontal than vertical. There reaches a point where the gameplay loop of Elden Ring ends, and the way to overcome these obstacles is no longer engagement within the open world, but instead a demand of mastery and understanding. Now, this isn't in and of itself a bad thing. This is how most From Software games, and most Souls-like in general, are designed. In Dark Souls 3, once you beat the Dancer, you have access to enough Titanite chunks that the game will start throwing endgame threats at you. And at Sekiro, the damage you deal scales as you advance, so you can't do a loop around and come back outside of a few forked paths in the mid-game. Elden Ring defines itself on the new gameplay loop, introducing it masterfully in Limgrave, and then breaks it off here. I think he ends up criticized unfairly, since as he is that linchpin boss that either forces a player to enjoy the way the rest of the base game's roster will do things, or to give up, he ends up being unpleasant. Especially when you combine that with a sloppier boss fight, you get what I view as hate beyond what he rightly deserves. The pacing of the fight outside of the second phase works so well. The scale of seeing the Fire Giant, the discovery of the weak spot, and how it builds into that second phase leg break is something even better bosses in the game don't do quite as well. As far as second phase cutscenes go, this is one of my favorites. And after all this, I think the Fire Giant securely earns a B grade. If the second phase worked, I could see him going higher, as the parts of this fight that do work are executed well enough and leave enough of an impact that they should keep the Giant from the average grades, even amidst the sloppiness that the fight often has. And here we begin the final wave of the more standard bosses in the main game. As we build to the final bosses outside of the game's final gauntlet, the game will end up throwing a collection of 8 rematches at the player. Some of them make sense for the final area that the Consecrated round serves as, but there are a couple of really strange picks in here, with one of the strangest being a second version of the Mimic tier. The straight Mimic tier doesn't feel like it does anything different. It spends a little less time building up to the appearance of the Mimic tier, and it will naturally do a bit more damage and have a bit more health by the nature of copying a higher leveled player. The arena is also no longer unique. Instead of being fought in the ruins of a temple in Nokrin, this is a standard Catacomb boss chamber. All in all, I'm not a fan of this rematch. The Mimic tier relied on its own uniqueness in order to make the concept work, and there are a ton of enemies and bosses fully unique to the Underground. On top of that, the stray Mimic tier doesn't block progression in this dungeon that leads to the Snowfield. It is an optional boss within an optional dungeon. One of my favorite parts about the DLC was smaller bosses were required as you passed through their dungeon to break into another part of the map. It made discovering that dungeon and that boss feel all the more significant even when the boss itself was fairly shallow. Because of that, I think the Stray Mimic tier only earns a D grade. It loses a lot of the creative luster that the first match carried by being placed with so little reward. But whereas the Mimic tier was a strange choice for a boss in the final area due to its uniqueness, the Putrid Grave Warden Duelist is a strange boss for the opposite reason. The Grave Warden Duelist has long since become a basic enemy, and though the Putrid variation does have 8,800 hit points and inflicts rot on a hit, it feels really underwhelming for one of the game's final mini-bosses. As a reminder, Morgott was fragile with over 10,000 health, and the Grave Warden Duelists have no damage negation. The moveset here is still solid, but incredibly familiar to the player at this point. Though the rot provides a cool visual change, the few new attacks here aren't frequent enough to appear in a standard battle, and even when they do appear, they don't add much. The Duelist already had a grab, so another one doesn't complicate anything, and the Putrid Spit is similarly simple. As a boss, it's not bad, but it doesn't feel like an endgame encounter. Overall, I think it earns a C grade. It works, and it does look really cool, but lacks anything beyond the basics that the enemy does admittedly do well. The concept of the final version of the Knight's Cavalry being a duo fight is not too bizarre on its own. The Tree Sentinels had one, and the Knight's Cavalry are reminiscent enough that the two fights end up feeling fairly similar. The Knight's Cavalry do have less health than you'd expect at this point in the game, with 7,200 each, but with the health of the horse and the fact you'll potentially be dealing with 2 of them and a group of mobs, that stops them from feeling too fragile. Where the Knight's Cavalry end up strangest encounter is their placement in the overworld. In one of the most open spaces of the Snowfield, a caravan trudges through the storm, a weapon locked within. The strange part here is that the cavalry are only here at nighttime, whereas the caravan is here at any point in time. So if you find the caravan during the daytime, this huge climactic set piece just doesn't have the bosses here. Don't get me wrong, the Knight's Cavalry still drop a solid reward in their entire armor set and an ancient smithing stone, but it's strange that you can choose to just not deal with them to get the thing that they're guarding as their set piece. Like with the double Tree Sentinels, luring one of the Knight's Cavalry away isn't too difficult, though finding a space to attack once both are aggressive is much easier said than done. There are spaces that get created, but it's usually when one of the cavalry decides to do that massive loop around the space, rather than continuing to stay engaged. Each wields a different weapon of the two that we've seen, which helps to distinguish them, even if the movesets still overlap more often than not. As I mentioned, the caravan often introduces more enemies into the mix as well. Thankfully, the enemies are barely a problem, often killed in one hit at this point, or unable to move quickly enough to follow the player and cavalry in their battle. But it is another inconvenience in a fight that already lacks a lot of emphasis. Overall, I think this cavalry earns a C grade. It's one of the weakest cavalry, though it justifies itself much better than the worst versions of the enemy. Meanwhile, discussing fights that don't justify their own existence, Astel is back again as the final boss of the game's final mine. And though most of the fight remains functionally unchanged, Astel is one of those bosses that loses a lot of power when he's rematched. He's scaled enough to match the final area, going from the 11,000 the Remembrance version had to 18,600, which definitely gives the boss the physical presence it needs to provide a challenge this late in the game. The moveset here is functionally identical, though the arena is a bit of a step down. Unlike the first arena, which evoked imagery of a starry sky underground, this version is fought in a big cave with some yellow light. Though the eclectic design of Astel still shines through, it isn't empowered by the arena in the same way the first version was. The changes made to the moveset are more of a focus on what was a heavy contender for already Astel's worst move, his grab attack. Not only does he do his grab more frequently, but he has another grab that creates clones all around the arena that all grab at once, and it does not have a natural dodge timing. If they land this grab and your health is not maxed out with solid armor, you are dead. It just deals that much damage. I think the rematch with Astel only earns a C grade. There were already flaws that existed in the moveset, but with the atmosphere lingering behind, and the only additions compounding on the occasional frustrations the fight had, it doesn't age as well as one would hope. Though it does still manage to provide enough of a challenge to feel like one of the game's final mini-bosses. The final boss version of the Magma Worm, the Great Worm Theodorix, doesn't just scale to endgame, it skyrockets. Despite having no weak point, this final battle not only utilizes both phases of the Magma Worm, but boasts 25,650 health and deals enough damage to take a player out in a single blow with some of the heavier attacks. Like with the other Magma Worms, the moveset is simple enough that the challenge of avoiding damage is not too difficult. His arena, however, doesn't really give him the space necessary to shine. He feels almost tucked away at the back of this ravine, and pretty frequently charges into walls, especially in his first phase. The second phase and its more laser focus on the player does work better here, as the more targeted sword strikes don't feel quite as haphazard as his charges. I'm not the biggest fan of the lighting the Dark Ravine provides either. The Magma Worm's huge movements don't feel creepy or unnatural, so turning him into a silhouette doesn't really add anything to the battle. I don't use it within this footage, but there are a number of land octopuses in the area around the Great Worm, and his AI is designed to target the octopuses and vice versa. This means players can use those creatures combined with summons to get the upper hand against the incredibly high stats that Theodorix boasts. With a better atmosphere, Theodorix could be a contender for the best of the Magma Worms, but the Snowfield doesn't sell the player on this fight's atmosphere at all. I think the Great Worm Theodorix only earns a B grade, lingering a little behind the other fights that the Magma Worm excels the most in. And appearing in his first solo fight since the Weeping Peninsula, the Misbegotten Crusader is still incredibly good at punishing my lazy rolls with his moveset. The Misbegotten are not the most aggressive enemies, and they stagger off of most attacks. But with a little more posture, this Crusader is great at punishing laziness. Unfortunately, even the fact that he can punish laziness like mine doesn't mean that he can earn his place in the Consecrated Snowfield. With only 9,100 hit points and almost no resistances, the Crusader goes down too quickly. Even with that said, I do like the adjustments made to the fight here. The Crusader is made unique via his weapon in the same way that Leona Misbegotten was, wielding the Golden Order Greatsword. It looks visibly distinct and adds a really characterizing attack where he poses, then spins once into a holy projectile. I love it, and it builds up the image of the Elden Ring well. With some more endurance and health, I think this would justify itself as a great rematch. The aggression is higher, the new move is unique, and it remains simple while still satisfying to defeat due to the detailed moveset. The health being so low is the fight's fatal flaw, though, keeping it from ever being higher than a B grade. I love the Misbegotten as foes, and wish the two duo fights focused more on their weapon providing unique characterizing attacks, because the step up from Leona Misbegotten to Misbegotten Crusader does work really well. Meanwhile, the Putrid Avatar makes for a strange choice for a rematch. It works as well as the other Putrid Avatars do mechanically, though the rot doesn't work quite as well in the Snowfield as it did in Caelid's Red. The issue is that the battle with the Erdtree Avatar on the mountaintop of the Giants felt like the culmination of this enemy, whereas this Avatar only has 12,500 health. Not even 300 more than the Dragonbarrow variation. Though practically it still feels unique due to the crack tiers being different, It remains a strange variation for another twin avatar, and sticks out among the other final battles in the Snowfield. I think this Putrid avatar still earns a B grade, even though it lands much lower than the other Putrid variations did. Meanwhile, the final base game battle with the Deathbird feels like a culmination of the enemy in a way the Putrid avatar didn't, scaling up to 17,600 hit points, an amount that is definitely less intimidating if you utilize Holy. It is enough health to make the bird intimidating. The Deathbird also has a lot more damage here than it does in the Mountaintop variation. The arena feels a lot more cinematic too, with the cliff looking into nothing, and the flat terrain working really well to push the bird's atmosphere in a way it hadn't been since Liurnia. The issue with this arena is that the bird can pretty easily clip up into the mountain, making the attacks land in strange ways. And on top of that, there are apparently places the player can climb that the bird just can't reach. Even with those flaws, I still really like this final Deathbird. It feels like one of these final field bosses ought to. If you're fully equipped, the fight is balanced and challenging, but the bird feels overwhelming if the player isn't ready for the bosses that will make up the rest of this video. It ends up being a great litmus test and feels like a great final version of the enemy and one of the more memorable battles of the Snowfield. As our final field boss of this experience, it is a great example as to how good these fights can feel. Joining the rest of his crew, this Deathbird earns another B grade. Though the Liurnia version is still my favorite, this one comes in a close second. But with the final wave of mini-bosses behind us, there are only 10 boss encounters left to analyze, and all of them are great enemies or remembrances. The first of them is one of the 2 required fights for entering the DLC now, and one of my favorite foes, Mohg, Lord of Blood. The first phase here is almost identical to the Omen fight in the Royal Capital, adding in more health as well as a couple setup moves that build towards the second phase's unique moveset. To begin, the fight starts with a cutscene this time, with Mohg rising from a pool of blood to greet Miquella. This cutscene is beautifully uncomfortable, as Mohg's obsession with becoming Miquella's consort and leading the world to his new dynasty makes Mohg feel like one of the most sinister demigods. Except the DLC turned this fight from a finale to an introduction, one that begins to set up a story that will not come to the conclusion until the end of the DLC, and I love how that evolved the context of this fight. We learn later Miquella is the one in control here, and Mohg's death here is just a part of this plan. This fight, even before the DLC was created, ended up laying the groundwork for the man, the myth, the legend, Sir Ansbach himself, before Ansbach even existed. Mohg's presence as a character in this battle is strong enough that they could build some of their greatest NPC arcs on top of it. The scale of the soundtrack here is at its peak, and though Mohg worked well enough in the darkness of the sewers, the intense crimson lighting that fills this arena not only reveals the details of his design, but provides enough darkness to still make the portals and magic that Mohg rely on pop. More importantly, this starts to make Mohg feel like a part of the arena. In the first fight, he stuck out against the room, feeling wrong in it, but here, he feels like the Lord of Blood that his health bar declares him as. Though his health didn't increase much, only rising from 14,000 to 18,300, Mohg uses his second phase to create a really interesting pace compared to other final battles. As you work your way through his health bar, he'll cast 3 magical spells, counting down, and once his health is low, he'll chant Nihil, triggering bleed 3 times and healing a massive amount with each triggering, as well as growing a pair of black wings and gaining access to a new moveset and a full immunity to his shackle. With enough aggression, or through strategy, it is possible to kill him before he finishes his phase transition. On top of that, the player can use a niche tier that avoids the damage the phase transition does to them in order to save them resources. Resources stressed more by an additional buff that Mohg gets, namely that his damage increases by around 20% for a period of time after anyone has been affected by bleed, which I absolutely adore as a mechanic. And this second phase escalates the first in a great way. Mohg now uses his wings to fly around the arena, spin, and spread the flaming blood at even further distances. Combined with an increased aggression and movement speed, all of Mohg's basic slams, slashes, and lunges start to add after effects that add additional blood flame, which escalates the arena control that Mohg already excelled at and covers the arena with a constant threat. It threatens trying to escape Mohg and encourages continuing to push in and keep pressure on, something made incredibly difficult with how aggressive Mohg is in this phase and how mobile he's become. On top of that, despite the size of the black wings, the raised nature of them on his back means that Mohg's arms and weapons stay visible and clear, enhancing his silhouette rather than confusing it, which is definitely not foreshadowing an issue I have with another boss. Mohg, the Lord of Blood, is an S-grade fight. Though there are ways to abuse the lower health total, like with Common Azure, the variation of ways to deal with the second phase transition makes the fight customizable in a way I really enjoy. Loretta, the Knight of the Halig Tree, is one of the least memorable of the last 10 bosses in the game. As I mentioned in Royal Knight Loretta, the moveset here is all things the player has seen before, and Loretta's physical form gives it a vulnerability to status effects that it didn't previously had. Loretta's health here is also a fairly flimsy 13,400. She's one of the game's most fragile final battles. The moveset here is still solid, not only because it works well individually, but because it almost brings Elden Ring full circle in a satisfying way. The first real boss in the game was the Tree Sentinel, and though that boss is too simple to be a final boss on its own, Loretta uses the base of the Tree Sentinel and builds on it in a satisfying way as the final required battle before what was considered the hardest boss in the game. Instead of using a great shield, Loretta uses a light shield that does not get used for blocking her attacks, instead serving as a catalyst for her magical spells and phase change. Her melee attacks almost completely match the Tree Sentinel with leaping swings and sweeps that are satisfying and not too difficult to dodge at this point. In exchange for the shield, she has a lot more magical focus and aggression, hopping backwards with a smoothness that the Sentinel never used in order to cast daggers that home in on the player, soul arrows that float towards them, a single magical bolt, or creating a magical arrow. An attack that eventually splits into multiple arrows, making the dodge timing just a little more precise without being too major of a change. It's a satisfying magical moveset, especially the summoned daggers, which are satisfying to dodge while still putting on pressure and overlap well with her methodical melee attacks. Like with the Regal Ancestor Spirit, the largest issue with this boss is that the Royal Knight Loretta already revealed what all these magical capabilities would be, meaning Loretta won't ever catch a player off guard with anything. Because of this, I think Loretta only earns a B grade. The moveset feels like an evolution of the Tree Sentinel, providing a solid endgame threat without being as significant of a challenge as the other final bosses, and though she did steal her own thunder, she's satisfying and a simple endgame foe to take down and remind you of exactly how far you've come, especially with how demanding the fight that follows after is. And that brings us to Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, who was, prior to the DLC, a contender for the single most discussed and debated boss in Elden Ring. To some, this is From Software at their best. An astonishing atmosphere and design that creates smooth and quick combos built around a unique regeneration mechanic. To others, this is From Software at their worst. Attacks that are unnatural and unfair to dodge, with strange minor design choices that significantly add to the challenge she presents. I thought a lot about this fight to try to decide how best to analyze it, and even now, I feel like 3 wins is not enough to be fully comfortable with breaking the boss down. But as I see it, Malenia is a perfectly alright encounter, with some admittedly incredible design brought down by what I see as 3, kind of 4 depending on how you count, issues. Before I get into those issues, I want to talk about what this fight does well, because frankly, there is a lot of really good stuff happening here. As a hidden boss, the arena does a great job serving as the culmination of everything that came prior. The player has climbed up and down into the Halig tree to find Malenia at its heart. The concept of this legendary warrior with a prosthetic leg, fake arm, and the sword built into it with this mask to cover what little is left of her face as she announces her presence and makes a vow to the player at the same time. She is the Blade of Miquella. She has never known defeat. And without even saying it, the threat is clear. Today is not the day she loses. One thing that makes Malenia really stick out among the other large threats in From Software games is that she actually staggers to most melee attacks, meaning that though her attacks can continue for a long period of time, once the player learns when they get to attack, they can use rolling strikes and jump attacks to stop her combo strings in a really satisfying way. I was dreading this fight when I recorded this playthrough, and despite that, using the faster weapon in the katanas made these windows of opportunity feel incredibly plentiful. The starts to her combos also feel really good. The dash forward into a slam is amazing, and that dart to the slide into a rush forward is exceptional. The only attack I'm not a fan of in her bread and butter combos, and the first of my issues with the boss, is also what is the least important problem, and probably just a personal issue, that sword wiggle attack. She darts forward and does a triple wiggle forward with her blade. There is a tell in a click from the sword, but that click can also mean that she's about to do a dash that requires you to delay your dodge, and it's never felt great to dodge like the rest of her moveset has for me. It's possible that after a few more runs and a few more versions, it might click in, but this attack always broke me out of the flow state the rest of the battle lured me into. She also has a grab that deals an absurd amount of damage, but also provides a huge window to punish if you avoid it. And, of course, she has the Waterfowl Dance, which I will get to later. Her combined health bars are large, boasting around 18,500 health in her first phase, though a weakness to bleed and frostbite encourages players to take percentage chunks out of her health bar. Like Mohg, she actually has more than that amount of health, because not only is there a second phase, healing her around 80% of her health, but whenever she lands a hit on the player, she heals. I actually really like this gimmick in the first phase, especially with how precise most of her moveset is. I think it does struggle a bit more in the second phase, which I'll get to as one of my issues, but the only issue I have with her healing is that it still heals even if the player blocks the attack and takes no damage, which, though it doesn't negate shield builds entirely, does massively discourage their use, at least to a first-time player. My beef with that is that the best way to deal with many of her faster attacks without relying on muscle memory is using a shield, especially that aforementioned wiggle attack. But using what the game provides as one of the best responses is punished by her healing, and that's just never sat quite right with me. The damage negation the shield grants does mean it's still easier to get through the battle, but it just makes the fight drag on. Eventually, though, Malenia will go down, and the second phase doesn't quite click for me like the first phase does. Now, it's not because of the massively increased aggression, or the Scarlet Rot after effects, or her two new attacks, a Scarlet Bloom that provides a rare moment to rest and use items if you avoid it, or a series of clones that, though difficult to dodge completely, still feel precise enough that the player can see and feel what's hitting them at any time. My issue is that I cannot see what is happening when I am behind her. I don't know if this is just me, but I completely lose track of her sword in the visual chaos of her wings. And when that combines with the increased aggression, it makes it tough to figure out what she's doing, and makes me take damage that doesn't feel as fair as it does in the first phase. With that said, I also need to mention how good the phase transition is. She turns into a flower of Scarlet Rot, and the design here, in a vacuum, is incredible. Her pale skin makes the prosthetic limbs stick out, and though I don't like the wings in motion, it's impossible not to admit how absolutely stunning they look in this cutscene. The music restarting as the flower blooms and Malenia rising into the air as the Goddess of Rot are one of those incredible moments that I will never forget. In a game often defined by excellent second phase transitions, Malenia's is something else. That said, when I mentioned there were 3 or 4 things that bothered me, that included the wiggle attack, healing through block, and the wings. A lot of those can boil down to personal taste. I can see people liking any of those anyway, but anyone who's seen any Elden Ring content will know what my last frustration is, because it is now potentially the single most notorious move in all of Elden Ring, even after the DLC, the Waterfowl Dance. And before I get into this, there are responses that exist to the Waterfowl Dance, and they are pretty simple to execute. I learned after recording this particular playthrough that the player can throw a Frost Pot to stagger Malenia and build up Frostbite, and if I had known this, I probably would have tried to do the second phase without the Mimic. Dodging without that Freeze Pot, though, is frequently frustrating. All the ways to dodge it are less built on instinct and more on developing a strategy to avoid the damage. Some people use a triple light roll backwards as she rises up, some time jumps around parts of the combo, some lock on and sprint around her feet to throw off the AI's aims. There are always tells the player will look for and know how to react, but the waterfowl dance goes a little too far in my opinion. When one of the best ways to dodge it in certain positions is to break her AI's aim, or to use a specific consumable in order to not have to deal with it at all, that's not a great sign for the move's dodgeability. It's just not a fun move to learn to dodge. It's the kind of move that, when she does it, makes you sigh in frustration, because you just don't want to deal with it. But with everything said and done, Malenia is hard to grade. When I finished my first playthrough, I was certain I hated her, because the few things that frustrated me had overshadowed the rest of her impeccable moveset. And though I still have issues with some of those attacks, the ratio has shifted for most of my issues for everything but the waterfowl. I think she earns a B grade, but the fight is honestly a little RNG dependent in terms of how enjoyable it is. When you get an attempt that sticks to the bread and butter of her moveset, it is incredibly satisfying. Some people will say B is too low, some people will say it's too high for Malenia, but I think she is still an above average boss, just not a boss that I personally see as a highlight of any of my runs. Though that last ranking inevitably already created a wave of comments raging that I dare to put Malenia in the same grade as the Fire Giant, the next take here is probably going to be the hottest of the entire series. I think the Godskin Duo is pretty okay. Now, hear me out on this one. I've already mentioned that I think each of the Godskin make for good enemies and great bosses in that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'd make for a great duo fight. The two of them constantly overlap with each other, especially if you're unfortunate enough to get both of them into their second phase at the same time. However, unlike other duo fights like the Crucible Knight and Misbegotten, I feel like the Godskin Duo is built around the concept of the player being forced to find ways to even the playing field and keep it that way. The Godskin Duo operates off a single health bar with 26,300 hit points, welcome to the late game, but the Apostle and Noble have 6,600 and 8,000 hit points accordingly. Now, this isn't a real duo fight, it is a battle of waves, trying to take out a Godskin before its compatriot is summoned back, and then continuing that pattern until you've mowed your way through the collective health bar. There are a lot of small concessions made to make this fight work smoother. A player can attack the bodies of the Godskin as they disappear to get more damage on the shared health pool to shorten the fight, and the Godskin have a long animation that leaves them vulnerable as they summon their compatriot back, meaning a player can realize they're running out of time and rush them down. And that's before all the other options that exist here. The Godskin are incredibly weak to sleep as a status effect, and the player can choose to summon Spirit Ashes to get the initial upper hand and try and reach that flow state where they're going from one Godskin to the other as they work their way through that shared health bar. The biggest issue is, of course, that the attacks overlap. The series' best duo fights have all had ways to separate your opponents. Smo's and Ornstein's charges, the Demon Prince's aggression alternation mechanic, moves that create a clear pace and way to take down the fight. The Godskin suffer because they don't have that. Players will often find themselves needing to trade hits to get the fight started, and I wish that instead, the battle started with a single Godskin with a 15 or 25 second timer before it starts to summon its first compatriot. But this does bring me to an interesting discussion that has likely already snuck its way into the comments after I used the Mimic tier on Malenia's second phase. Elden Ring is built with Spirit Ashes and summons that can join the player the entire way through. Playing without them is playing with a handicap. The inclusion of an additional summon can swing fights pretty hard from impossible to being overrun without any challenge, so I tried to fight, for the most part, every boss without using spirit summons. Duo fights are that one type of battle that aren't quite as swingy once the player starts to utilize summons, as the player still has to deal with the full aggression of one of those enemies, and needs to focus on working alongside the summon if they want to combine with the threaded outputs to put the fight back into the player's favor again. Now, before I grade the Godskin Duo, I do have to give a very negative shout out to the rolling attack from the Noble. It gets caught on the columns in such bizarre ways here, and the only positive is that the Noble can't summon the Apostle back while it's spinning, which makes the attack turn into a pause button rather than anything engaging. But that doesn't make it any better. Especially if the Apostle is still upright, this move is unbearable. I think the Godskin Duo is another of the endgame battles to earn a B grade, and don't worry, Malenia is at the top of the B grade. Both Fire Giant and the Godskin Duo are below her overall. But there are enough positives that I think the duo does earn the accolade, especially considering how the Godskin battles, particularly the Spirit Caller Snail, built towards this fight. Once the player reaches the Fire Giant, the end of Elden Ring becomes a gauntlet of required battles. All of the Snowfield is optional, which means that the game goes with almost no downtime from Fire Giant to Godskin Duo to Malekith, Gideon, Godfrey, and the final bosses. And the Snowfield doesn't require that the player even beat Fire Giant, which means it's very possible for the end of the game to turn into an onslaught of the game's hardest foes. There is one exception to this gauntlet, however, Dragonlord Placidusax, who requires access to Farum Azula, but has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the boss gauntlet at the end of the game. With 26,600 health and a resistance of at least 35 to everything outside of piercing damage, and a strange lacking of the weakness to weapons that deal additional damage to dragons, Placidusax is often the heftiest opponent in the base game. That doesn't mean he's the hardest, however, because despite his high damage and health, he's fairly stationary. Even before that, the Dragonlord is also the only boss in the entire base game with a runback, which definitely makes him stick out. After dropping down into a hidden area, the player lies down on the ground, where the tornado the area is built around begins to reverse, and with it, time itself reverses. The arena is rebuilt out of the rubble, and at the heart of the storm is Placidusax, floating in the air. I love his design here. The damage and empty sockets where heads used to be make this dragon feel like some ancient being who has faced countless foes. The gravity of the opponent is sold without the drama or musical flair that most cutscenes utilize. The first phase is pretty simple, but decently effective. He constantly summons down lightning, foreshadowed by a huge area that turns red before the bolt storms down. It's a short enough blast that the player can time their roll or just keep circling around the dragon, though that gets rid of a lot of the attack windows. On top of that, the timing on the tail's sweep is incredibly slick, and the claw swipes extended by lightning feel awesome and like an evolution of the ancient dragon's significantly less fun lightning attacks. The one place the fight loses me are the breath attacks. Placidusax is so large that it's hard to get eyes on all of his body at once, and though some attacks are easy to predict, like a breath that goes along the side of his body and asks you to jump over his tail, downward breath attacks are hard to tell apart. Is this a breath you need to run away from or push in towards him for? He also feels massively unique from the rest of the dragon fights, Sin and beyond. Though he has a weakness on his head still coded in, it's not something you can realistically target, making him one of the only dragons this late in the series to not have that mechanic. He's also very stationary, to the point that it is his greatest weakness. After all, how can you possibly escape the player's attacks with how broken he is? Which is, of course, a question that Phase 2 happily answers as he starts teleporting into nothing before appearing from the sky with a huge slam. After this, the entire fight comes into its own in a big way. The claw strikes become more complicated, he'll teleport around the arena out of your combos and back into the sky, and he starts to more actively call down lightning. He even manages to push himself into the air to teleport again, simultaneously increasing the stakes of the fight, while still selling the player on how broken and worn this lord has become. There are also two new mega attacks. The first being the Dragonlord calling a lightning storm that covers what feels like every part of the arena into another aerial charge that builds into both heads, performing a massively long-range laser show. Though the attack looks great, it doesn't feel great to dodge, namely because the lasers don't follow any real recognizable or easy-to-feel pattern. Placidusax's attacks move him a lot in the second phase, which is fixed by his ability to teleport back into melee combat. When he sits back and performs a light show that the player doesn't have a way to challenge and whips around attacks, it feels like a stop to the fight that doesn't even end with a satisfying conclusion. The second attack, meanwhile, has him summon a bolt of lightning so powerful that the first tell is the boss's music stopping and being replaced by an audio tell. The entire floor turns red, and the game's message is crystal clear. Run away. The attack goes by quickly enough to not stop the fight, but lingers enough to sell the impact on the explosion. It also builds on the red ground that signals lightning bolts in a great way. It's just a really cool move. I like Placidusax a lot, but it lacks a bit compared to the series' best dragons. Though it feels huge and outputs enough damage to be a challenge, the fight occasionally leads towards being too passive or too delayed. It sells how dilapidated the Dragonlord has become, but it doesn't sell you on how much you ought to fear the beast as he rushes you down. I also really struggle with the teleporting rush, namely because I wish the cloud showed up earlier.
Watching this storm cloud materialize into a dragon is awesome, but the cloud isn't really present for long, which is a shame since, outside of the explosion, it's his most cinematic moment. Though the introduction to the fight is interesting, it also lacks a lot of the build-up of other late-game bosses. You feel the power, but the stakes aren't as high as they are with other late-game dragons. Kalameet, Sin, Midir, they all foreshadowed their encounter, and it paid off a lot. Meanwhile, Placidusax can and is often missed, with no one ever knowing. But even with those few problems, the Dragonlord still earns an A grade. The spectacle works well even if it may not fit the dragon design niche that the other dragons in the series fill. It serves as an excellent pause amid the brutality of the endgame gauntlet. And though the final bosses of the game do boast more health, I've always personally found that the hardest of the late game gauntlet in Elden Ring's base game is Malekith, the Black Blade. He's also one of the most interesting in terms of how the game builds him up. The Godskin are introduced in earlier boss fights, Gideon is an NPC throughout the whole game, Godfrey has an earlier fight with a spectral variation, and the final boss uses the music to sell the player on the wait. Malekith's foreshadowing is a completely optional NPC questline. In the Dragonbarrow, accessible via a teleporter or behind the Blackblade kindred, is Gronk, who asks the player to feed him Deathroot, a resource found in boss fights against powerful undead. And in that questline, there comes a moment when Gronk loses control and attacks. And though his damage is far lower there, the aggression he puts out as the Beast Clergyman is intimidating, especially in the tight space. If you die, he'll calm the next time you arrive. Otherwise, if you deal enough damage, he examines his left hand before calming down, promising not to forget again. Depending on the player's progression in Gronk's quest, there are different lines that open this fight as the Beast Clergyman rushes at the player. If they haven't been feeding Gronk, then they're greeted with a vow that the player shall not reach destined death. If you have, he seems almost betrayed upon seeing the Tarnished, and it's clear he doesn't want to fight, but feels obliged. Combined with the weight that Farum Azula carries as an area, it makes Gronk carry even more weight. It changes all of his dialogue too, even if only in subtle ways. Both kill quotes, one from each phase, and the final words as he falls and his phase transition all adjust. And it makes it really rewarding to have done Gronk's quest. Now of course the first thing that sticks out with Malekith is his health. He only has 10,600 health, while both the other Farum Azula bosses had over double that. Despite that, even in his first phase, landing any hit is easier said than done. Gronk has a blade in his right hand, but the main threat comes from shockwaves and AoEs. These shotgun throws, a quick backstep with a double slash, rock throws, and more. The Clergyman never stops, closes the distance absurdly fast, and does really high damage. But this is nothing compared to the meat of the fight. After reaching 55% of his health bar, Malekith reveals himself. He plunges his knife into an amulet on his left hand and transforms into the Black Blade. And oh my god, he looks so fucking cool. The armor forming and burning away his rags as that short blade becomes a massive black greatsword, combining with just that single line of dialogue, makes for an incredibly powerful moment. He is intimidating, he is cool, he does everything he needs to do, and so, with only around 5,500 hit points, what can Malekith's second phase do that makes him so overwhelming? The answer, of course, is that Malekith is a sentient Beyblade. Once he transforms, Malekith is an overwhelming boss to learn. He's constantly sidestepping, leaping into the air, varying combos, releasing after effect AoEs, making ground bursts, shooting projectiles, and more. And on top of all of that chaos, if you get hit by the blade, he lowers your max health and inflicts a damage over time effect that he does not ever give you time to heal from. Millennia may have a single move impossible to dodge, but Malekith is a constant storm of attacks, and there are so many of them that telling the difference as you try and learn his various customizable combos is beyond a tall order. He is a glass cannon, yes, but he will kill the player faster than they can kill him on most attempts, especially as they proceed into new game cycles. I end up mixed on Malekith. He feels incredibly cool as he leaps from column to column with his acrobatic attacks, and the customizable nature of the combos makes him feel unpredictable in a way most other bosses aren't. But he moves so fast that even watching the footage back, it's sometimes hard to see what I was supposed to have done to avoid it. When I watch myself take damage on the Clergyman, I can see where I made the mistake. Malekith, on the other hand, is so fast that even watching the footage I still could not predict with 100 accuracy what attack was supposed to be coming next and what I was supposed to be doing to prepare for it. Take a look at this attempt here. Maliketh opens with a melee combo that lands in a heavy downward blow. This is not actually the opportunity though, because he then starts a tracking spin ending with a hit that creates an AoE. I of course tried to stay in to punish after the downward blow, but I actually needed to turn and run away or try to sneak behind him. Here, I just barely stop myself from healing as I see him tense up to leap into the air for a slam that I expect will end with an explosion. Healing as he lands that slam, it turns out that wasn't an explosion. That leaping slam was preparation for another leaping slam that was going to end in an AoE. And every combo is like this. Maliketh flies around the arena with so many attacks that string together so fast that it feels almost impossible to keep track of what he's doing. As I mentioned though, he only has 5,500 health in this phase. Any more and he'd be far beyond a nightmare. As a glass cannon though, a player that started to figure out the general pace of the fight can burst through him before being caught in the storm of attacks they aren't ready for, which does stop him from being frustrating. On top of that, if the player acquires the Blasphemous Claw, they're able to use it to parry any blade attack that glows golden, creating a huge window to get in damage and finally stop his offense. With that said, Maliketh presents an interesting conversation. He can be learned. There are slight tells and patterns within the combos that players can notice over time, even if they feel random in the first watchings. But just because something can be learned doesn't mean that it's not a problem. The moveset doesn't feel like it was designed to be learned, it feels designed for the challenge, and the player can learn it despite that. It does heavy damage, lowers your max health, inflicts damage over time, and so many deaths here are often the result of not being able to get somewhere safe in time in order to heal, and just instead dying slowly from an attack you missed. On top of that, the knack for leaping out of the way as both the clergyman and as Maliketh can make what often feels like it's supposed to be a window non-existent, meaning players are encouraged to go for attacks knowing you might just get hit with the next one. The Blasphemous Claw does a lot to keep this fight from descending into unfun territory on challenge runs, but it's telling that I've seen AGDQ speedruns completely restart the Maliketh fight if the clergyman does not do the single specific correct attack at the start of the battle. That is how precisely this fight is choreographed to perform it well, that there is no backup strategy. You kill him quickly or you are done. The same question appears in a lot of Elden Ring's base game. There are ways to position yourself to reliably hit the Fire Giant's hands in the second phase, but does that mean it's fun? There are ways to avoid the Waterfowl dance, but does that mean it is as fun as the core melee loop of the rest of her moveset? And fun is of course fully opinion-based. Does the fact that I don't like something mean that it is inherently bad? At what point is an attack classified as hard enough to learn that it takes away from the encounter as a whole? Where that line sits is going to vary from player to player, and I think Maliketh rests right on that line for my own personal tastes. With Millennia, it was only a few attacks, but it's a lot harder to adapt here because it is the core gameplay loop of that second phase moveset. Because of that, I think Maliketh earns another B grade. The design is beatable, but often not exciting to learn, and though there are enough considerations within the moveset, health bar, and Blasphemous Claw's existence that I cannot grade it poorly or even average, it drags down a fight that had the potential to be one of the highlights of the game. Instead, it rests too heavily on its style to stay standing among the game's best. Within the final gauntlet of huge cinematic bosses, we have one major outlier, and I'll let the introductory cutscene of the entire game introduce him properly.
Sir Gideon Othniel, the all-knowing.
Now it is a bold choice to have one of the final required bosses be an NPC battle, especially one as experimental as Gideon. Gideon's moveset is pretty standard. He can swing his staff, summon homing daggers, or use repeated soul arrows. He can cast Comet Azure or throw golden discs that return towards the player. He can also put a buff on himself that explodes after he's been hit enough, which can be tough to deal with. Though he only has 6,200 health, he also has one Estus he can heal with, which provides him enough health to feel like an NPC while still not be too fragile. That said, his decision to stand and monologue at the start of your first attempt means it's pretty easy to start by overwhelming him before he gets the chance to do anything at all. You might have also noticed, however, that half the moves I just described are not in this footage, and he is using a ton of attacks that I did not describe. That's because Gideon's moveset is directly tied to which of the mid to late game remembrances have been beaten prior to Malekith's death. If all three have been beaten, he'll lose Comet Azure and his Rings of Light, and instead gain an attack from each of those bosses: Rykard's Skull, Mohg's Blood Spray, and Malenia's Scarlet Aeonia. With these attacks all active, Gideon evolves from a fairly standard mage fight to a far more chaotic one that focuses on traps and arena control. With most spells, it's a matter of dodge than punish, but a higher level player who's beaten these better hidden foes is rewarded with a much harder to punish mage. The Skull Trail in particular is hard to break through, the Blood Spray controls the arena way more than the Golden Discs did, and the Scarlet Aeonia can only be challenged with range of your own without risking heavy damage. The customizability of this fight makes it incredibly fun as you learn the different variations of his moveset. Unlocking and locking certain moves is really satisfying, and it helps make Gideon feel like a mage in the way other NPC fights, like Rvier, just couldn't. Gideon's attacks are non-stop, which makes taking him down all the more satisfying. I wish that he didn't give the player the opportunity to start the fight on their own terms as much on the first attempt. Opening with a heavy attack or a backstab can let a fully geared player absolutely decimate the fight before getting to see anything it does. On the other hand, having a much simpler to defeat NPC battle amid the otherwise demanding final gauntlet also serves as a really natural breath of fresh air. Gideon still feels like an endgame threat even if he goes down easier than the likes of Malekith or Godfrey. I think Gideon does crack into the A grade. That's right, I think he's a more engaging fight than Malenia or Malekith, and I'm not sorry for it. The highs of those battles are higher than Gideon, yes, but the things Gideon demands of the player have a lot less potential to feel unfun or frustrating, and a lot more potential for the player to feel like they've created this enemy that now stands in their way. The penultimate challenge of Elden Ring is Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, and though his starting moveset had already been revealed to the player, this, to me, is the most successful battle of the final gauntlet for almost every reason. So without further ado, let me begin by gushing about the introductory cutscene. Upon re-entering Morgott's arena at the base of the now flaming tree, you're met with a roar of pain, and then you see the figure you once saw as an illusion cradling Morgott's body. And as Godfrey personally calls you out, Morgott's body fades away into the same grace that led you here throughout the game. But now, that same grace leads Godfrey towards the player. Godfrey's voice actor nails it here. He feels like he is about to explode with every line and word that he says, but keeps stopping himself before he does. I also love how he raises the axe like Godric did way back at the start of the game, but instead of slamming it down, he enters a more practical combat stance and stomps his own foot to create a shockwave. It is a small deal that combines with everything else to really build up Godfrey as this ideal that everyone has looked towards. And with that, Morgott's arena finds itself in use again for Godfrey, as he now comes at the player with the same moveset they saw pressing their way towards this arena originally. Of course, the addition of the lion and sound effects gives Godfrey a lot more presence than his Golden Spectre had, and before too long, Godfrey begins to tear open the ground for the first time with a huge shockwave, making the player immediately aware of the power of the foe that they are facing. And after that first tear, Godfrey starts making a ton more shockwaves, stomps, and ground rips that can be jumped or rolled. The speed that he alternates between them hits that perfect tempo that Malekith and Malenia struggle to sink into, where he feels both relentless and powerful but never unreasonable. The use of sound effects for the longer stomp also does a great job of selling the power and communicating when to effectively dodge the attack. He has less hit points than a lot of the other late game bosses, boasting just short of 22,000, but it's still enough health to have a strong presence and feel like one of the game's final challenges. Overall though, the phase just feels really good to fight. He covers the entire arena, he looks incredible, and every attack feels good to roll or jump over and through. The escalation of the stomps and ground tears feel natural, satisfying, and fair, while the introduction of the moveset earlier means the player can focus on learning these new shockwaves and stomps, which are the only part of this moveset that persists into the second phase. Meaning in the second phase, they'll already know the shockwaves and stomps, they just need to learn the new melee concept. It's a great evolution. Speaking of that evolution, around 40% of his health bar, Siraj, the lion on his back, begins to step forward and become physical, and then the game throws a complete 180 at the player. Siraj doesn't join the fight against Godfrey, he ends up sacrificed for it. Godfrey tears the lion off him, drenching himself in blood. and as Godfrey rises up, he reclaims his true name, with the restraint in the voice acting disappearing as Godfrey throws away his armor and his axe. The instrumentation of the song remains the same, but goes absolutely wild, particularly with the horns, as the nature of the fight changes completely. As I mentioned, the moveset still utilizes shockwaves, but escalates that to the next level. Hoaraloo is now constantly stomping and slamming to create huge waves and explosions, and on top of that, he replaces the distance and reach with martial attacks that feel reminiscent of claw strikes, and then combines that with a collection of grabs and slams that feel and look massive. The weight with every single attack, even his faster ones, makes this fight feel unlike anything else in the game. His grabs are amazing, from this one-handed grab and slam into the ground, to both his infamous leaps into the air that powerbomb the player down to the ground for frankly unholy amounts of damage. Hoaraloo manages to feel like the quintessential Elden Ring boss while avoiding every drawback common to that formula. He closes the distance incredibly quickly, his attacks and grabs have long delays for cinematic effect, and he has a habit of dashing forward and to the side in and out of attacks. Yet, he also manages to avoid every struggle that other late game bosses deal with. His roars and flashiness provide just enough windows to heal, and his cinematic stylings last just long enough to pause the fight without ever stopping it entirely. The delays all have a similar rhythm to them as well, which sorts the attacks into the quick and the slow ones, using animations, sound effects, and what feel almost like slow motion shots to differentiate them perfectly. And though he dashes out of counterattacks, he doesn't do it as frequently as foes like Malekith, who is almost constant with his dodging of heavier attacks. Godfrey is another contender for my favorite fight in Elden Ring if you couldn't tell, and is another easy S grade. It does everything so tightly and so well that in the gauntlet of endgame fights, it shines due to its precision and constant fairness. Like with Emma and Ishin Ashina, I want to talk about Radagon and the Elden Beast separately. Though you need to beat both back-to-back to succeed, these two fights are polar opposites in terms of how they try to build the climax to its finale. Most of the final bosses we've analyzed throughout this series were melancholic at best. Gwyn, Soul of Cinder, and Gehrman in particular are solemn battles, breaking the mold of the soundtrack as you face the individual partially responsible for the state of the world. Radagon takes the second part of that, but injects a more action-focused atmosphere into the mix. In the opening cutscene, you watch Marika drop from a rune arc before reaching forward and grabbing a piece of stone shaped as a hammer. As her body transforms into that of Radagon's, who is also Marika, it's complicated, a golden energy completes the rest of the broken body and charges the hammer. And as he raises his hammer into the air, we get the single best needle drop in Elden Ring. The main theme of the game blasts forward as Radagon's half-broken body turns towards you, the golden rune inside him illuminating. And goddamn, this theme works so well as a boss theme. Though it may not tug on the heartstrings like Gwyn, the amount of excitement and finality that it creates is untouched. The theme is constantly driving with the bass and drum lines, and the vocals add a layer of spectacle onto the fight. It just feels so good. Though I love boss themes throughout this entire series, the trope of the main theme recurring into the final boss is incredibly good. And though the Moon Presence used it, Radagon nails it in a way the Moon Presence never did. Radagon, like Emma, is designed as a first phase, but unlike Emma, he has as much, if not more, mechanical depth than the boss that he protects. Radagon's health is much lower to accommodate this, clocking in at just over 14,000 hit points, and though he makes use of that health, I do wish Radagon received his own battle rather than being regulated to this half-battle state. Though there isn't a clear split between his phases like in other battles, Radagon does escalate as the player works their way through the health bar. At first, he'll use hammer swings that press forward quickly, often ending combos with charged slams to create shockwaves that can be rolled or jumped over, much like the Black Blade Kindred's axe. On top of that, Radagon uses stomps with shockwaves in order to gain an upper hand, tosses a couple quick bolts of lightning, and has a huge golden grab where Radagon demonstrates what the Elden Ring felt like when he tried to fix it. On top of that, there are some huge swings that focus entirely on creating an AoE. Some leap him into the air for a huge single strike, while others create pulse after pulse that need to be dodged. The timing on the third of these slams is a little too tight for my taste, since you'll need to stay close enough to roll behind him to avoid the hammer and shockwave, but it still never feels fully unfair. As the fight progresses though, he not only starts more frequently using lightning bolts that now stay in the ground and explode after a moment, but much more threateningly begins to teleport and create an AoE to both escape combos and press in on the player. And this can lead to some hilarious combos that punish panic rolling and greed in hilarious ways. Look at this death. This is a contender for my favorite death in any of my playthroughs of any FromSoft game. I was laughing so hard afterwards I needed to stop because this shit was absolutely hilarious. There are so few bosses as wildly entertaining to lose to as Radagon. Now, can these attacks overlap in frustrating ways? Yes, the shockwave of the stomps and teleport has to be dodged, and the teleport can be spammed to a frequently frustrating effect, especially considering the player is trying to conserve their resources for the rest of the fight to come. But with his health as low as it is, the fight never feels overly dense or complicated. It does successfully feel like a first phase building towards the Elden Beast. Overall, Radagon's biggest issue is that he's just the first phase of the fight, and the second phase, minor spoiler for my opinions, doesn't stick to the landing like Radagon does. It does build off Radagon, but having to redo this mechanically dense fight to learn the moves of a messier fight starts to make things frustrating. If we were just looking at mechanics, I'd likely give Radagon an A grade, but that music just gets me every time, and I can't honor him with anything but an S grade. Once Radagon goes down, Elden Ring switches gears completely with the Elden Beast. The main theme drops away as the light inside Radagon reveals itself. It rises up, the golden lifeblood forming this giant snake thing with wings and a sword. It looks unique and alien, but I think it's a little too strange. Though Astel was even more incomprehensible, there was enough intention that looking at the design immediately invoked a feeling of disgust and horror. Elden Beast feels off, it feels like it doesn't belong, but it doesn't hit in that same way. And I suppose to some extent that is the game's intention. The Elden Beast is supposed to be unknowable and unattainable without feeling like a complete eldritch horror, but that doesn't mean it makes for a satisfying final design. The music completely shifts and adjusts here too. Where Radagon's theme was the empowering finale for the player, the Elden Beast leans more towards a mystical nature. And the music here is easily my favorite part of this fight. The sorrowful soprano over the methodical chanting and almost imperceptible instrumentation for most of the song makes this feel like you're watching the end of an era, like the player is taking down something so ancient and old. And though there is sorrow in this action, the beast is almost accepting their fate. On top of that, every time the player strikes the beast, what sounds like musical chimes ring out, and that layers with the music in a really fun way. The issue here is the moveset and concept of the fight, which doesn't bring it home. Where Radagon is constantly pressing forward with hammer swings and teleports, the Elden Ring is defined by its habit to run away and cast spells at the player. Most of the sword swings are independently satisfying to dodge, but even the best of the spells just bring the fight to a sudden halt. Rings that need to be jumped over as the player runs out of the area of an AoE can feel satisfying to dodge, until the Elden Beast attacks while you still can't see what's happening through the explosion. The other spells are almost all worse. Holy arrows will home in on the player, requiring them to run in a straight line, and even if the player dodges correctly, they'll sometimes still deal chip damage. And with 22,000 health and another boss that you have to beat before you even get the chance to try and learn these moves, the chip damage eating through your few remaining flasks does not feel great. But the worst of the spells is easily Elden Stars, which creates a large projectile that spawns additional projectiles that will follow the player. And even if the player is running away, they'll more than likely still get hit by the small attacks as they do. And of course, between all these spells, sword swings, breath attacks, grabs, and general AoEs, the player is chasing down the Elden Beast just to try to land a few hits. Which means it's time to talk about the horse in the room. When I started this video series, this was how fighting the Elden Beast looked, but now, after the DLC's release, the player can use Torrent, and that does seem to do a lot for the fight. With the emphasis on horizontal spells and sword swings, and attacks that demand quick repositioning, as well as the ability to chase down the Elden Beast being the major obstacle the player is overcoming, using Torrent off and on as you deal with the barrages of attacks seems like it works really well, at least from footage I've watched. That said, it also presents another issue, since using Torrent dodges the worst attacks more reliably. Namely being that if the player decides to run in a big circle, there's nothing that the Elden Beast can do. With a complete immunity to statuses that's not too exploitable, but the Elden Beast doesn't have enough threat to chase down the player. I don't think the Elden Beast is a complete failure of a boss fight, but it looks even worse than it is next to Radagon's incredibly satisfying and clean design. The design works, just not incredibly well. And though the moveset feels satisfying when things work, unfortunate RNG that relies on these more frustrating attacks can make a long double feature boss fight become incredibly irritating minutes into it. I think I'd give the Elden Beast a C grade overall. It could be worse, and I'm hoping I'll enjoy the fight more when I have the opportunity to finally use Torrent on my next playthrough. And with that, we've analyzed all 166 if you count Radagon and Elden Beast separately, bosses in Elden Ring, which means it is time to begin on the beast that is Shadow of the Erdtree. At the time of recording this, which is also at the end of 2.5 weeks of being sick and having no voice, which is why this video took as long as it did, I finished 2 playthroughs of the DLC. Elden Ring is one of those games that only really clicks on the second playthrough for me, and though some bosses clicked on the first go-around, I'm really glad I had the opportunity to play it twice. Looking back at Elden Ring is strange compared to the other games in From Software. When we look at Sekiro and Bloodborne, the vast pool of mini-bosses brings that average grade of the fights further down than it feels like it should be. The abundance of bosses in Elden Ring does a lot, especially in the early game, to sell the player on the scale of the world, and the only place that it really starts to drain me as a player is in that mid-game. Areas like the Altus Plateau feel ridiculously repetitive, so much so that later playthroughs end up with me just charging through the entire zone, which is a shame. But as I'm finishing that script and recording up, I'll likely put out a couple other videos to avoid the next wait being as long as this one was. So, for the moment, thank you for joining me on this journey, even with the tail end of my sick voice here. If you haven't seen my other From Software Analysis videos, you can find the playlist here, and if you're interested in that Bell-Bearing Hunter Pathfinder 2e build, you can check it out here. Have a great morning, afternoon, and evening, and I'll see you all again shortly.
And though there's... as the hands start to flail a little... The Glintstone Dragon Adula is a contender for the strangest of the dragon. Oh my god, stop yawning! But this barbarian... Elderbert...